Okay, I have 11 o'clock in Perm, and it is 7 o'clock in Europe, and it is, I think, 11 o'clock in Arizona. Hello, Yuri. So we have a very, very international audience today. I hope both microphones are working. Okay, so this is the 9th International Conference on Applied Research in Economics and Finance. Unfortunately, this year again, we're holding this conference online. We hope very much that next year we will finally be able to gather together in Perm physically and see each other and communicate, because this is the whole purpose of the conference, ideally, so that people can speak to each other live. Today, the conference is in a very short, compact form. We are trying to give floor to everyone to present their papers, to advertise their research as much as possible. I will ask moderators of sessions to strictly watch the time so that the presentation is 15 minutes exactly. And if there are questions within the presentation, then it means that the speaker will have slightly less time to speak. But at the end of each session, there are 10 minutes in the program, and we will not turn off the channels. You can stay there, you can speak to each other, you are encouraged to do that. And ask questions and have discussions. I will also encourage everyone to use the chat facility on Zoom to write questions in the chat, and then the speaker can then read them after they finish their presentation, or if it is just a comment, for example, that doesn't need an immediate reaction, then write this comment in the chat and the speaker will read it afterwards, and you can discuss it during the break. One other minor thing that I wanted to draw attention to is that as in the last several years, we again partnering with the Journal of Industrial and Business Economics. The journal doesn't offer us a special issue for the conference. They do some special issues. As you can see, there is a special issue on industry dynamics and digital markets that is coming forward, but there is no special issue for a conference. What is there? There is an offer from the journal to do a very quick review of papers, given that they have been presented at this conference. And I am here at this conference. Former associate editors of the journals will also attend the conference, given that some people from the editorial board will be already aware of the papers that are presented here. This can accelerate the process of review for this journal. Just in case, if anyone is interested, feel free to contact me on the journal, and I can tell you what I may about the process for this journal. The journal has recently made it to the first quartile on Scopus, if it matters, and they have been selected for the emerging citation sources, which is the first step towards the Web of Science indexing. So the journal is progressing pretty well. So if you're interested in submitting your research there, contact me or submit and mention that you presented the paper at this conference. Don't want to be too long. The program says 5 minutes for the welcome speech. I welcome you all here. Unfortunately online, I wish we could do it live. I wish you all a very good conference. The first session on stream B will be chaired by Maria Molodchik. And I give you, Maria, the floor, and I will turn to my channel 1 and stream A, and will chair the session on finance, where we have Yuri Tsarlukevich from Arizona speaking. Yuri has the only person probably here who has a good evening yet. Everyone else already has a good morning, and Yuri has a good evening. So, Maria, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, once again, everybody is welcome to Perm in internet, but you're very welcome. We have 4 presentations, 3 about education and 1 about supply elasticity demand in labor market. I propose to start with Anastasia Bevaltseva.
Yes, thank you.
And you have a joint paper about different types of university, how to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. So Hello, everybody. I would like to present the research that we've conducted with my colleague Anna Panova on the topic of ways to succeed at different types of universities. The main motivation for our research was that the fact that under modern conditions, the academic profession has changed significantly. Some policies and some situations in the higher economic sector has led to the changing teaching component, as well as now professors have new duties. They are involved in research, as well as they are involved in administrative service. And therefore, in order to succeed at their universities, they need to balance between these three things that are connected with their work. Also, I would like to cover a little bit the Russian academic sector and the way it functions. Now we do not have a developed academic market. However, there is a system that allows to create several motivations for faculty to improve their performance. First of all, this is the government who sets policies on state universities. And in case they obey these policies, they receive funding. And then, while allocating this funding between faculty members, they use incentive contracts. And in case faculty members perform really well or outperform, they get some bonuses, meaning that they receive salaries that are greater than an average level. And otherwise, they receive some penalties. And therefore, this scheme creates a set of motivations for faculty members to improve their performance for becoming more successful than the average level at universities, so becoming more successful relative to their peers. Apart from that, our government has set several policies that changed the Russian context. First of all, there were policies that has led to the forming of a group of elite universities doing research, or we call them leading universities in Russia. Also, there has been a policy that introduced incentive contracts instead of the former tariff system. And now the salary of faculty members is linked to some observable indicators of their productivity. And also there was a policy on faculty remuneration, and it says that faculty members should have a salary that is not less than the average salary in the regional economy multiplied by 2. And according to this policy, they provide annual reports on how well they perform and what the average salary at these universities is. So taking into account all these context of the Russian academic sector, we've decided to use the following data. First of all, it's the survey, IPEX survey on Russian faculty. So international faculty was not included there. It was a set of questions that are connected to some work characteristics of faculty, some individual characteristics, as well as they also told us about their salary. And in order to look at the average salaries at universities, we use monitoring of university efficiency that collects data from universities on the annual basis. The whole sample was divided into 2 parts. The first one is those universities that are more research-oriented. They are represented by leading universities in our sample. And the second subsample is the universities that are less research-oriented, and we call them teaching-oriented universities. The main model that was used in the research was a regression, with the response variable being the difference between the individual wage that was set by individuals in the questionnaire and the average wage at this university. And so in case this difference is positive, we perceive it that the faculty member outperforms and gets some bonuses for this good performance, for good work. And in case it is negative, this is a kind of a penalty for poor performance. As explanatory variables, we've used various factors connected to work characteristics, type of employment, different duties a person has, publications in different types of journals, academic degree, as well as we controlled for individual characteristics and regional factor. The main results are presented here, and we can see that there are factors that are significant for success at both types of universities. However, there are some differences as well. As for the factors that are significant for both types of universities, these are, for example, senior administrative posts. However, at teaching-oriented universities, not only senior administrative posts, but also administrative duties matter for success. And here, it is important to note that these are not administrative posts that a person officially holds, but these are administrative duties. So in case a person has some service duties, but they're not included in his or her status. Also, we can see that doctoral degree is an important factor for success at both types of universities. However, at teaching-oriented universities, candidate degree also matters. As for publications, we can see that at teaching-oriented universities, in order to succeed, faculty members have to publish in foreign journals, while at research-oriented universities, this is not enough, and they need to publish in top journals that are indexed by Scopus or Web of Science basis. We can also see that experience matters only at research-oriented universities. And here also important to mention that this is not the overall working experience, because this factor appeared to be insignificant, as well as the presence of external experience was also insignificant. This is the experience only at this particular university or internal experience. The next thing we've done, we've tried to answer the question, what if faculty change the type of university they work in? And the results show that if faculty from research-oriented universities go to teaching-oriented universities, they would succeed relative to those peers who already work there. However, the opposite is unlikely, and teaching-oriented and research-oriented universities are not likely to welcome faculty from teaching-oriented universities. What is more, we've conducted the robustness check, so whether our results are robust to the average wage we use. Because previously I've mentioned that we use the wage taken from the monitoring of university efficiency, and by now this is the only data that is publicly available to everybody, and in case faculty members want to look at the average wage of the universities, they can go to the website of the monitoring and look at the data. However, there is a risk that this data is overstated and the wages are higher than the real wages at universities. And we decided to check this by using the average wages calculated on the basis of the survey we use, because individuals reported on their wages and we calculated the averages from them. And it turns out that despite the fact that these wages may differ twofold on the basis of which data we use, but the but the estimation results do not change, and the conclusions we draw from our research also do not change, no matter what data on average wages we use. So the major conclusions that can be drawn from our research is that senior administrative post is important for success at both types of universities. However, at teaching-oriented universities, participating in administrative duties is also an important factor of success. We can see that at research-oriented universities, teaching still matters and is an important success factor for faculty members. What is more, faculty here should pay attention to the quality of the papers they publish, and they need to focus on top journals when they publish their papers in order to succeed. We can also see that despite the fact that incentive contracts were introduced around 10 years ago, there are still features, for example, experience or the academic degree, that still matter for success. And these features are like the features from the tariff system. However, there are still, there are now becoming some features that are important from incentive contracts, for example, the quality and the quantity of papers being published. Thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to receive your comments or to answer the questions if you have any.
Anastasia, thank you very much. We have 4 minutes for one question. Please, everybody's welcome. Who wants to ask?
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I wonder, you said you calculated the average wages from the reports, but the average wages are average wages at this institution, right? At a certain institution. So if you have you had 1,000 participants, but they came from many universities. So per each university, you had only a selection, right? So the average wages do not really reflect the whole university, and probably you have a selection of more interested participants. So I don't know. So you probably don't have the full distribution of incomes there, right?
I see. Thank you for the question. Yes, this can also be the case as well, but faculty members were selected randomly at each university for this survey. So it is more or less representative. And we had about 20 or 30 participants from each university, which is like not 2 or 3. So it's quite enough for calculating the averages.
So did everybody, so you said represent, but many people they get an invitation, don't participate, or was this organized through the university administration to make sure that people were more keener to participate?
I'm not sure, but I believe that it is organized from administration and people have no choice to answer or not.
And,
Thanks.
Sorry,
Thank
could
you.
I also add something about this paper? We also have information about average salary in each institution, since we have a monitoring of efficiency. So we also use this average for each institution, not only based on this survey.
I see. So that was the first measure you presented, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I also want to ask, you have measured success by salary, or by delta?
By difference between the individual salary and average salary.
Okay, and this is like common knowledge in such kind of studies. I mean, maybe you have missed this part in the presentation, but how previous studies have measured this kind of success in the university?
The most common, as for success, I guess there were no studies who were focused on success. Usually studies are explicitly focused on the salary, and they want to find the factors that influence the salary. However, we have no market. That's why the salary is not the best indicator for using it in the research. And since we have this motivation for faculty, or they kind of compete inside universities, and that's why we want to reflect somehow this competition by using the difference between the wages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in that sense, I would recommend to be more implicit by the use of this word success.
Mm-hmm.
Because success in academia, it's not only salary or this difference.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if anybody has some comments, you can use chat. And I would like to invite the next presenter, also from Moscow. Sorry that organizer have written everybody's from Perm.
No, it was because we first prepared the program for the hybrid format, and the organizer mentioned that where will be the presenter.
Okay. The floor I will give to Alexei Zamnius.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Paper about labor supplied elasticity.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, good morning, dear colleagues. And today I would like to tell you about the microdata-based estimation of labor supply elasticity in Russia. So the labor supply elasticity is a crucial parameter in many economic policy analyses, which determines the hours and employment impact of wage shocks. And these shocks can be caused either due to changes in taxes or business cycles. And due to its importance, a large number of studies have estimated the labor supply elasticity. However, there are only 2 articles about the elasticity of labor supply in Russia, and moreover, the results aren't robust and describe only a specific type of labor supply response to a specific wage shock. And this makes the estimation of labor supply elasticity a relevant task for Russia, because the lack of this parameter's reasonable estimates may lead to wrong prediction made by macroeconomic models. But before starting a discussion about the estimation procedure, it's necessary to understand how labor supply will respond to certain types of labor income shocks. And this can be demonstrated in a static framework where an individual maximizes his utility function subject to budget constraint, where consumption, which is an equality of consumer spending, and to the amount of labor and non-labor earnings. So this problem can be represented graphically with labor on the x-axis and consumption on the y-axis, where L overlined denotes the total available hours. And the point A is then the initial equilibrium. With an increase in wages, new equilibrium point D is attained, and the change in leisure demand AD represents the uncompensated demand reduction. The compensated demand reduction AB represents the pure substitution effect in response to a price change. And an example of such a change is the reaction to labor supply to an increase in tax rates, since it is assumed that these funds collected are returned to individuals in form of transfers. And the response to short-term fluctuation in labor income, which do not affect the level of consumption, is denoted by AG, and it's called the Frisch response. And the estimation of this parameter, this free responses, is the main subject of this study. So for the purposes, we use the life cycle model with uncertainty from McCarthy's 1983 paper, where a representative agent maximizes his expected lifetime utility depending on consumption, hours worked, and preferences, subject to a dynamic budget constraint where A denotes the assets. So we assume that individuals are uncertain about future prices and their preferences, that wage rate is unaffected by consumer behavior, and that the utility function in period T given by U is separable in consumption and hours worked. So in order to satisfy the third assumption, we use the CRRA utility function, which is a very commonly used in the literature on life cycle models. Also suppose that preferences are given by the following functional form, where Z represents is a vector of measured determinants of preferences, and epsilon represents the unobserved characteristics. So the solution to this problem will be the marginal utility of wealth constant functions, which are often referred as Frisch demand functions for consumption and labor supply, where lambda denotes the marginal utility of wealth in period T, and nu is the forecast error. So McCarthy uses the Euler equation to express the marginal utility of wealth in period T as a sum of an individual component, a trend, and an error term. Similar to Altony, we solve the equation for the Frisch demand function for consumption for lambda as a function of consumption. And the substitution for lambda in the Frisch labor supply function leads us to a new labor supply function, which allows one to estimate both structural parameters of the CRRA utility, theta and delta. And from the values of these parameters, we can construct the Marshall, Higgs, and Frisch labor supply elasticities. The Marshallian elasticity measures the changes in hours worked and participation due to the change in the entire life cycle wage profile. The Higgsian elasticity measures the change due to the same change in the entire life cycle wage profile, but after netting off the extra resources from the lifetime budget constraint. So the Higgsian elasticity is the right concept to discuss the impact of funded change in the tax system that does not change the distribution of resources across the individuals. And the Frisch elasticity measures the variation of labor supply due to anticipated changes in the wage. So the Frisch elasticity is the right concept to discuss the impact of business cycle fluctuation in wages because it is also equal to the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So also the overall level of work activity can be separated into the number of individuals in work and the intensity to work of those who supply hours. And this reflects the distinction between whether to work and how much to work at the individual level, which are referred to respectively as the extensive and intensive margin of labor supply. And the same idea is true for labor supply elasticities. The aggregate labor supply elasticity is the sum of the elasticity of probability to work and the elasticity of hours worked. And in our work, we focus on the estimation of the aggregate labor supply elasticity, which implies the estimation of both intensive and extensive margin elasticities. But to estimate the labor supply functions, we have to deal with multiple sources of bias. Firstly, consumption is correlated with unobserved preferences. The endogeneity of consumption may be handled through the instrumental variable scheme. And we specify the first stage regression for consumption as a marginal utility of wealth constant demand function for consumption. And in this case, the marginal utility of wealth in period T in period 0 can be approximated by a fixed effect. However, if we substitute the lambda constant consumption labor supply functions to the lifetime budget constraint, it turns out that the marginal utility of wealth in period 0 implicitly depends on the preferences of the individual throughout his whole life cycle. And therefore, the fixed effect won't be a valid instrument for consumption. And to overcome this problem, I alternately suggest to use the permanent wage component, assuming that it is not related to preferences, but to labor and non-labor income throughout the whole life cycle as an instrumental variable for consumption. And in this model, we used the real after-tax household income. We also used the OECD equivalent scale to account for the effects of the household size of their own income. And an important advantage of this indicator is that it is observed either for workers and non-workers. Secondly, wages are correlated with unobserved preferences, but the permanent income remains a valid instrumental variable for wages because it contains information about the labor earning path within the life cycle. And the problem number 3 is selection bias, which arises because wages and hours cannot be observed from non-workers. And therefore, it is necessary to refer to the Heckman procedure. And based on the foregoing, we developed the following estimation procedure. At the first step, we estimate the reduced employment equation to create the inverse Mills ratio used to purge the selection bias from subsequent wage and hours worked regressions. At the second step, we estimate the reduced income equation. And based on its coefficients, we can calculate the smoothed income path, which is a proxy for permanent differences across individuals in lifetime income. At the third and fourth step, the wage and consumption equation are estimated within the instrumental variable procedure. And in the fifth and the sixth step, the structural employment and hours worked regressions are estimated, which yields estimates of Marshall, Higgs, and Frisch elasticities at the extensive and intensive margin, respectively. So in our study, we use an unbalanced panel for RLMS survey for the period 2000 till 2018. And our sample contains of women and men aged 25 to 55 who are married to the same spouse. We also set a minimal amount of observation per person, which is equal to 9 according to Heckman's paper from 1981. And the reason for this restriction is to overcome the incidental parameters problem while estimating the fixed effect probit models. So based on the literature review on the Russian labor market, we can highlight 5 facts about it. Firstly, wages on the Russian labor market are very flexible comparing to other European countries. Labor supply in Russia reacts poorly to permanent wage shocks. During periods of high unemployment, individuals become discouraged about finding a job and leave the labor force. So in other words, there is evidence for a discouraged worker effect. Also, people reach their earning peak during the working age, and the hours impact of wage shocks is insignificant. And now I would like to show you our most interesting results. Let us begin with the wage equation. As we can see, the wage rate is increasing at a decreasing rate when the individual gets older, and moreover, men reach their earning peak during the working age. The elasticity of wages with respect to local unemployment describes the wage rigidity, and according to Blanchflower's estimates for Eastern Europe, its value lies in the range from -0.3 to -0.1. And as we can see, our estimates lie closer to the lower bound, which reflects that the fact that wages are relatively flexible. Both of these results are consistent with several other Russian studies. So now consider the estimates of the structural employment equation. We can see that an increase in the number of children less than 6 years old increases the probability to work for men and decreases the probability to work for women. An increase in number of children more than 6 years old enhances the probability to work for both men and women. An increase in the local unemployment rate enhances the probability to work, which indicates the added worker effect. So on the one hand, Klepikova found evidence on the discouraged worker effect in Russia, but on the other hand, there are macroeconomic studies according to which the added worker effect prevails in developing countries. So next, consider the estimates of structural hours worked equation. And as we can see, a number of children increases the hours of working women. An increase in the local unemployment rate decreases the hours for men. This may be due to the fact that in times of crisis, the probability of working for women increases. Based on the estimation of the structural employment and hours worked regression, we can calculate the Marshall, Higgs, and Fisher elasticities for labor supply at the extensive and intensive margin respectively. We also use Bootstrap to construct the confidence intervals for all coefficients. And it is notable that the Marshallian elasticities turn out to be negative. This is somewhat an unusual result, although it is still found in the literature. It is also consistent with the added worker effect and the hypothesis of a weak labor supply response to macroeconomic shock, which is one of the elements of the Russian labor market model. We also can see that the labor supply elasticities at the intensive margin are significant, which reflect the significant hours impact of wage shocks. Next, we can sum these components and obtain the estimates for aggregated elasticities for women and men. Finally, we can weight them by the average shares of the employed by sex and obtain the estimates of the aggregate elasticities for Russia. In comparing these estimates with those in the literature, the most unusual finding is negative Marshallian elasticity for women. And usually it is positive, but it underscores that the weakness of the aggregate labor supply response to permanent labor income shocks come not only from men, but also to a large extent from women. So to sum up, wages on the Russian labor market are very flexible comparing to the other European countries. Labor supply in Russia reacts poorly to permanent wage shocks. During periods of high unemployment, individuals seek to find a new job. In other words, there is evidence of an added worker effect. Also, people reach their earning peak during their working age, and the hours impact of wage shocks is significant. That's it with my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes for one question. Please, who wants to ask? Be in a hurry, or we can switch. I would like to ask one question. If you claim that your paper contributes to the method, you propose a new method how to measure elasticity, and in the conclusion,
to estimate the elasticity.
To estimate elasticity, and in the conclusion you don't mention it about this.
Yes, I could have mentioned it, but I thought that in the
no, I mean that maybe in conclusion you should underline that the main contribution is method.
Yes, okay, maybe, yes, it's true.
Because this is more about empiric. This is absolutely interesting new knowledge about Russia. But as I have read your paper, I consider it like a new knowledge in not in empiric, but in method. But maybe it was my impression. Okay, thank you very much once again. And now we turn into Ilya Prahov and Bernarda Sarmiento. Am I right? Okay, Ilya, you're always welcome in Perm. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's always nice to present at iCare, and this is a joint paper with my colleague Bernardo Pinchera. This project analyzes the differences in current academic achievement of students of a highly selective university. As you know, currently the Unified State Exam is the main mechanism of applicant selection to higher education institutions in Russia, and it represents a set of standardized exams. It was introduced more than 10 years ago, and now there is the most common way of being admitted to university. Nevertheless, there are several alternative mechanisms for admission to university preserved from the selection mechanism which existed before the introduction of the Unified State Exam. And Olympiads is the second mechanism of admission, usually for high achievers, and usually this mechanism is used for being admitted to the most selective universities. So the Olympiad is a competition usually for the core subject, and the winners of the Olympiads have certain preferences upon admission. For example, they can be admitted without any competition, or they can report their like 100 score instead of their actual Unified State Exam score for the certain subjects. However, there are some problems, some potential problems with the Unified State Exam and Olympiads, especially in the segment of highly selective institutions. In recent years, there has been a trend when a number of the most selective universities had a lack of available tuition-free positions for the applicants on the USC basis, because the vast majority of those were taken by the winners of the Olympiads. So the first problem is the limited accessibility of high quality higher education and inequality of educational opportunities, even for those who sat the Unified State Exam and got very high scores, but those scores are not usually every time enough to be admitted to a highly selective university. The second potential problem is inefficient matching between students and universities. So, for example, students can decrease their effort and decrease their academic achievement when studying at universities. So there can be a discrepancy between their results at the entry and their current academic achievement. And the next problem is a long-term one, that inequality during admission can be transformed into inequality in the labor market and inequality of further life trajectories. This is because of the variation in the returns from higher education. And we all know that the most selective universities are associated with the highest returns from education. So those applicants who were not able to enter such university can examine the lower rate of return from their education. So the main research question is estimating the impact of the selection mechanism and UC results in various subjects on current academic achievement. And here are some explanations why can the current performance of students differ from their previous educational achievements. And here are some reasons for that. For example, applicants planning to enter according to the Unified State Exam, they usually prepare for 3 or 4 subjects at the same time. And usually these subjects cover the most program for the first or the second year. But the applicants who decide to be enrolled through the Olympiad usually focus on only one subject. and thus they reduce individual efforts related to the study of other disciplines. And the last reason is I've talked about that the students simply can decrease their efforts after admission, so they pass the unified state exam or they won the Olympiads, and now they're students, they won't be sent to the army and so on, so they can just reduce their effort to the minimal level, not to be dropped out from the university, and this usually happens. Previous studies show high positive correlations between the results of the standardized exam and current academic achievement in the United States. And here we see the results for SAT, the analog of the unified state exam. The positive correlation is observed between alternative metrics and current academic performance, but researchers highlight the importance of family social economic status and schooling background for unbiased estimation. If we turn to Russia, there are several similar studies, and usually they demonstrate that the unified state results have predictive power. They can predict further academic performance at the university, but if we consider the most selective universities, usually the winners of the Olympiads outperform those who entered on the unified state exam basis. And also we can mention the results for the less selective universities and for the branches of the selective universities. Here we can see a positive relationship between the unified state exam and academic performance of freshmen. But the last study by Havinson and Solovyova, based on the huge data set on 19,000 students from 5 Russian universities, show that academic performance in the subsequent years on the second, third, and fourth courses is determined by the achievement in the first year, but not by the unified state exams, but result. But the UC result can affect student achievement indirectly. Here we use administrative data from Higher School of Economics, the Faculty of Economic Sciences, and we consider students who were enrolled in 2017. Here is the table of admission statistics showing that HEC and Faculty of Economic Sciences are very selective universities, so the minimum UC average is around 92, 93 out of 100. So this level of selectivity is very high. And we have data on the unified state exam success, on the Olympiad success, and we have current scores for the first and for the second year for different subjects. And here is the descriptive statistics. First, we decided to see if there are any difference between the students depending on their wave of admission, and we almost see no difference in family status and average GPA between two subgroups of Olympiad students, and also there's no difference in the average score between those who were admitted by the unified state exam and the huge group of the joint group of Olympiad students, but still they have some difference in family status and schooling status, and they have differences in their results at the entry, difference in their unified state exam. Here are the differences in the current academic achievement on the selected subjects. And here we may see that in general, before controlling for other variables, those who were admitted with the Olympiad study better than those who passed the unified state exam on 3 subjects at the first course, but there's no statistical difference by the second year. And then we run 2 sets of progressions. The first one is simple OLS, when we try to predict the current current achievement on different subjects, and we include the variable showing the success at the Olympiads, the set of unified state variables, state exam variables, controls, and also we use an alternative method, this propensity score matching. We try to build the matched sample as if the participation in Olympiad was random. So this is a quasi-experimental method. And here, before running the regression, we see high correlation between the unified state exam results in social sciences, Russian and English, but mathematics does not correlate with other subjects significantly. That's why we include in our regression models Russian UC score and mathematics. And Russian UC score can be expressed via score in social sciences and English. Just to avoid multicollinearity, we include only 1 score. And here we can see the results for the first course. And we see that students who were admitted on the Olympiad basis outperform those who were admitted by the unified state exam. But the difference is not that big. It's around 1 point out of 10. But also the unified state exam in Russian has some predictive power for certain subjects, and for certain subjects, female students study better than their male colleagues. But for the second year, the differences in achievement between Olympiad and non-Olympiad students are smoothed out. So we don't see any statistical difference in achievement between UEC students and Olympiad students. But still, for certain subjects, the unified state exam in Russian has some predictive power. And we have almost the same results using propensity score matching. So for 3 out of 6 subjects, Olympiad winners outperform those who set the unified state exam at the first year, but the effect is not that big. It's like 0.6, 0.7 points. But the unified state exam in Russian has some predictive power. And also we demonstrate that in like 50% cases, girls outperform boys. But again, for the second year, we don't see any difference in achievement. So what do we have? The unified state exam scores in Russian can predict academic performance in a number of subjects, but the overall effect, the unified state exam effect, is stronger in the first year. The Olympiad students outperform their peers in the first year subjects, in all subjects except English, but these differences are smoothed out. And here are some questions for discussion and for the future research. First of all, it's about short-term effect of the Olympiads. Why are there no difference in achievement by the second year? Is that because of peer effects? And here we have 2 variants. Those who came with their unified state exam results, they study better, they try to compete with Olympiad students, or vice versa, all students in this cohort feel relaxed after being admitted to highly selective universities, and they just diminish the level of effort to the median one. Then we have neutrality of family and school. Maybe this is because of the biased sample, because we have lots of students from better social backgrounds, or maybe we have indirect USC effects because family and school effects can already be expressed in the unified state exam scores. Also, we have neutral effect, no effect for student mobility, but we demonstrated that in some subjects, girls demonstrate higher academic achievement. And this is a very interesting feature of this study because, for example, labor market studies show that the university graduates, girls who graduated from the universities earn less than their male students. So there is a gender gap. And it's interesting to see why does it happen, because girls study better and after graduation they receive lower salaries than male graduates. And also the last point, there is also serious preparation, pre-entry coaching for the Olympiads, which often requires significant resources. And those resources may not be available to low-income families. So this can create another source of inequality at the entry, and that's why this question should be considered in more detail. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. You are exactly on time. And in that sense, we don't have any time for questions. Please read them in the chat.
Okay.
And I will give the floor to the next presenter, Angelina Shpilevaya, if I'm not mistaken, about economic policy in higher education. The floor is yours.
Yes, you're right. Good morning, dear colleagues. My name is Angelina, and today I'm going to talk about microeconomic general equilibrium model with education sector. This model is based on overlapping generations model with 60 generations and include 4 blocks. The block of households, firms, the university, and the government. People in this model not only choose the optimal trajectory of consumption and savings, but also make another important economic decision. They choose the level of education. They get the general secondary education or higher education, and more precise bachelor's degree. And it is the story about how different we are and how our preferences affect our decisions and general economic equilibrium. We know that all individuals are heterogeneous in terms of the risk aversion parameter, learning ability, discount rate, stock of initial wealth, and many other parameters. And in our study, we'll talk about the first 2. And in our model, we'll use a standard CRRA utility function, but with heterogeneous parameter theta. Due to heterogeneity of this parameter, we should know how it is distributed among the population, and there were some papers estimating this distribution. We'll use this one, which is close to the presented just now, but it has a little bit lower expected value. In our model, we also suppose that the future income is not determined, and there is a distribution of future earnings, and as a consequence, more risk-averse people may choose not to receive higher education. And we can find some evidence in the papers presented on the slide. Also, the next dimension of heterogeneity is ability. And this question is complicated and we can discuss it for hours, but for our model, we should fix just two ideas. The first one is that we suppose that people in general who better performed at school and passed their exams better will also better perform at work. We will measure the learning ability with unified state exam scores for 3 exams with an expected value of 180. Also, the next idea is following, that in Russia we have minimum passing score for admission to a university, and in our model it equals approximately 120 points. And people who passed this threshold can be divided in 2 groups. The second group that got between A minimum and A prime scores, they can get higher education, however, they cannot get a subsidy. And the third group, they passed their exams good, and they can get a subsidy, a 100% subsidy. So there are 4 blocks in our model. The first is individuals, which are heterogeneous in their ability and theta parameter, and they maximize their expected integral utility. The firms that produce goods and services and try to maximize their profits. Educational institution that minimizes the costs of producing a given volume of educational services, and the government that collects taxes and subsidizes education costs, and the budget should be balanced. Another important feature that we should mention is that in our model we also have endogenous scientific progress, and scientific progress depend on the average years of schooling. So let's move to calibration parameters of this model. So we use standard for Russia tax rates. We use consumption tax, wage tax, profit tax, and unified social tax. Also, we use standard delta and alpha values for such models. So the first result, we also must mention one more thing, that income profile. We all know that income profile is not linear throughout life, and we'll say that the wage of an individual depends on his working experience, abilities, education, and wage rate per unit of effective labor in the economy. So the first of the important results, which I'd like to draw your attention to, is shown in the figure. We see that people with given learning ability but different risk aversion parameter make different decisions about their education. More risk averse people prefer to work and not to get higher education. And next we can simulate some scenarios. We can see the first basic scenario. with values close to real in Russia. And from this steady state, we can see some alternatives. What if the government didn't subsidize anyone? Then we can look in the second column and see that there will be about 34% people with higher education and will get lower outputs, approximately 9% lower. Also, we can try to subsidize everybody, and we see that in this case, we of course get a higher output, a higher percentage of people who get the higher education, but also it leads us to a steady state with a very high interest rate. Another simulation is try to subsidize all and to see what would happen if there is no threshold to enter to the university, and we get even more educated people, but there are also 3% people who will not choose higher education even with 100% subsidy. Another scenario is to try to distribute the same amount of subsidies as in the basic scenario to more people, but to subsidize not 100% of tuition fees, but 15%. And we see that in this case, we get a steady state with a higher percentage of educated people with higher output and with lower Gini coefficient. So I think that it is all that I wanted to say. So thank you for your attention.
Angelina, thank you very much. It's always interesting to see before you do something, I mean by policy, before what may be the outcome, and then to decide what to do. Please, the participants of the conference, now we are 21, please be more active and ask the questions. We have 15 minutes left for the next session. It seems that everybody is thinking about about your presentation. In any case, there are full text of all presentations of all the reports are available on the website of the conference, and you can take time to read it more carefully, more attentively, and ask questions and be in contact with the authors. If there are no questions, we can take a coffee and then come back in 10 minutes to the next session. Thank you once again for participation in this meeting. Hope to see you soon in 15 minutes. Okay.
Hi, Dmitry.
Hi, thank you for chairing this session.
No problem, it's my pleasure.
Thank you.
I hope everything works.
It does work, and
Yes.
every participant can share their screen. You don't need to switch anything, so you just watch the time and offer the some place for discussion in the end.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes sharp each presentation, so we need to leave all questions at the end.
Yes, yes. Try to make it sharp. And the only thing, after your session, please advise everyone that the keynote will be on channel 1, so that they use the break to switch to channel 1.
Okay.
I will be partly in your channel, partly in channel 1. I will be switching. Good luck with your session.
Okay. Thank you, Dimitri. So I think we can start. I see that everyone is here. Welcome to this session on regional economics and finance. We have 3 papers. Oops. 15 minutes sharp each one. So I will leave the floor to Joaquin, who is talking about migration and technological changes in China. And we need to leave the questions for the end of the talk. So Joaquin, the floor is yours. You can start. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to give this presentation. My name is Huaxin Wang Lu, and my today's topic is about industry transformation and migration in China. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Here is an outline of my speaking. And to begin with the presentation, I first introduce a very basic but special concept in China that is called hukou. It refers to a household registration system implemented in mainland China, which you could consider it like a domestic passport. But the role of hukou is even much more important than the passport because it's tightly connected with many social programs provided by the central and the regional governments, like public education, social security, residence, etc., etc. And by now, there are 3 rounds of hukou reform. The latest round was initiated in 2014, and it aimed at removing all registration threshold in small and medium-sized Chinese cities. So following the latest round of hukou reform, China's internal migrant population has started to shrink. It's not only the result of the hukou reform, which make more people to permanently settle down, but also because the migration pattern in China has been changing. And also in 2015, China has been ranked as an upper middle income country, and the central government is dedicated to making the country to become a developed nation by 2035. And so to prevent the middle income traps, the central government hugely promotes industry upgrading, one of which most important plan is called the Made in China 2025. But China also faced off many challenges, and one of which very important is that its lack of sufficient labor force, particularly highly educated human capital, to get over the transition from labor-intensive manufacturing towards a service and knowledge-based economy. And the researchers found that the effects of hukou reform was far from ideal because migrants are still attracted to large cities. Also, it has been evidenced that within provincial migration has been more and more important than across provincial migration for potential migrants to evaluate both of their temporary or permanent migration projects. So what this evidence suggests? First, the economic inequality between cities within the same province might be enlarged. This is because less developed cities in developed province are very likely to lose its prospective labor force migrating from less developed province. But in contrast, relatively developed cities in less developed province tend to receive more labor force because now internal migrants prefer within provincial migration. So inequality across province may have a chance to be attenuated. And the second, which is also more important, is that the contradiction between industry transformation and employment will be acute because high-tech and heavy industry cannot absorb so many labors, while labor-intensive manufacturers are shrinking. So once people lose their jobs, it becomes harder and harder for them to get re-employment. And previously, very few studies paid attention to the impact of industry change on labor migration at the city level. But the prefecture city is the administrative unit of the hukou registration. So which means even two people are both native to the same province, they may have different hukou registered at different prefecture cities within that province. So examining labor mobility at the city level would be more meaningful than examining at the province level. And also very few studies previously involve individual characteristics in examining longitudinal effects. This is because with macro level data, many baseline characteristics like gender, age, or educational level are available to the researchers. So our conceptual framework are based on the migration prospect theory developed by Taka on the foundation of the seminal work on prospect theory. And in prospect theory, 4 features are applied to explaining migration decision in the migration prospect theory. That is reference dependence. It says that if you have $5 and an increase from 5 to 6 would be more meaningful to you than an increase from 20 to 21st in the future. And then loss aversion, it means the loss loom larger than gains, and diminishing sensitivities and risk attitudes. And so Taka manifests that changes in economic situation between the present and future in both origin and destination country significantly drive short-term bilateral migration flows, although in the long-term international migration pattern, living standards are more important. So what we add, first we introduce gender difference in risk preference. It has been widely found that women are more risk averse than men. So we assume that people with different risk attitudes, or say they have different level of risk aversion, their responsiveness or reaction to equivalent changes would be different. And the second, we elaborate the geographical reference dependence. It has been mentioned by Taka to use to explain why return migrants are more responsive to positive prospects in Germany than negative prospects in the host country, which violate the implication of loss aversion, but it's not well evidenced by him. And third, the context-based risk attitudes, because we think the risk attitudes of potential migrants won't be always the same, but instead their risk attitudes may vary depending on positive or negative perspective observed. And so in short,
Joaquin, yes. Sorry, you have 7 minutes left. Just wanted to tell you.
7 minutes?
7, yes. Okay. Yes, 7 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. And so we examine whether and how economic prospects within industry influence labor mobilities. And here is a theoretical model of our work. I do not go into details. And so we use 3 sets of data. The first is China Household Finance Survey, where we obtain our migrant as well as native samples. It also tells in which industry that individual, if they are an employee, work in. And then we match it with prefecture level employment statistics for 19 sub-industries. And we also request the hukou index developed by Zhang and his colleagues to further control heterogeneity across Chinese cities. And we use a linear probability regression first, and then we add fixed effects to the model. But because we have a quasi panel, so we employ hybrid methods instead of a fixed effects model. And therefore, robustness check, we have a two-step system GMM estimation. And finally, we have a quasi panel of around 67,000 individuals from more than 200 Chinese cities between 1996 and 2017. And here is a map at the city level, which presents the geographical distribution of immigrants. And there are two more maps with province level boundaries, the left for the secondary sector and the right for the tertiary sector. And here is a summary table. Here is 19 industries, and we classify them into primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. This is because we anticipate that people may change job across industry groups. So the probability for them to change job across the main sectors might be lower than the probability they move across industry groups. And here is the descriptive statistic. This is the table for the original datasets. And this is the table for the data after being merged. So you see, we have many observations after we merged the data. And here is the econometric model. We first define the indicator we examine. The first is prospect indicator. At the E is the amount of employment. So the prospect indicator, actually it's a proxy for prospect. So it's the annual difference in the amount of employment between time t and time t minus 1. And then we calculate the growth of employment, and then we use it to construct the rolling volatility. We use it as an alternative measure and test it in the GMM estimation. And then here is
sorry, Joaquin, just 4 minutes, then we have to wrap up. Sorry.
Okay. Here is the unilateral model, and here is the bilateral model. So we mainly estimate the equation 7. And here is a dynamic model. We add a logged dependent variable, and also we replace the explanatory variable with interest with a difference in difference indicator. And here is the results. So we see in column 3, a more mailing industry-specific employment in the origin city reduced the probability of emigration by 6.7%, and in contrast, an equal-sized increase in the destination city raised the likelihood of emigration by 6.4%. And we see that by comparing the value of two coefficients, people are more susceptible to changes in the origin city than in the destination city, which confirm our assumption about geographical reference dependence. And here we see the column 1 from the quadratic term. It indicates that migrants tend to be risk averse to industry employment change in the origin city, but risk friendly to variation in the potential destination city. And in column 2, we add a dummy is signal. It equals 1 if positive prospect and 0 otherwise. And we see the risk attitude change. I do not go into details. And then in column 4 and column 3 and 4, we see that compared to men's, women's evaluation are more susceptible to their industry-specific employment changes. And likewise, in column 6, where educated migrants tend to be more reactive than others who have never received higher education, facing larger scales of fluctuations. And here is the GMM estimation results. And in column 1, it's based on equation 8, and the column 2 and 3 based on equation 9. And we see the prospect for origin and destination city are statistically significant at the 5% level. And also the gap in prospect and its quadratic term in column 2 are significant at the 1% level. Also in column 4 and 4 to 6, we estimate another indicator volatility. So you see the origin city now have a positive coefficient and the destination city have a negative coefficient. And so it says that with a larger volatility, people are more likely to move out from the origin city and less likely to move in to the destination city. So the purpose of this paper was to examine whether and how the dynamic formation of industry structure influence individuals' migration decision. And we utilized a quasi panel to shed light on the effects of economic variability in specific industries, which signal future prospects in the origin and potential destination city to the workers who engaged or employed in those industries on their migration decisions. And it contributes to the existing literature by expanding the framework and model of migration prospect theory, enriching the scope and the level of empirical analysis for labor migration, and enhancing the comprehension of how labor mobility and regional industry employment are intertwined. And so it overall suggests the ongoing industrial reform exert an influence on labor mobility between Chinese cities. And a possible policy implication could be split to two parts. The first, that the regional government could provide training program to improve workers' employability in other industries and help enterprises to hire more people, particularly female workers. And the regional government also may pay attention to the consistency of economic growth, even just at the sub-industrial level. So thank you for your time to listen to the presentation. I'm more than happy to learn any comments or questions.
Okay, thank you. We can leave questions or comments in the chat. I would leave the floor directly to our second speaker, who is Natalia Nikitina, who is talking about the analysis of a house price dynamics in Russia. If you end the sharing of your screen, Joaquin, so okay. Natalia can share her screen.
Hello. Okay.
Thank you.
How to end it? Oh, sorry.
Natalia?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Natalia. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Today I will tell you about an analysis of house price dynamics in Russia. In 2020, house prices in Russia increased significantly. However, the cost of residential real estate in Russia has increased by 11%, but in some regions prices have risen by 20 or even 30%. And such an inexplicable price increase has become an occasion for discussion in a number of media, but the discussion hasn't yet managed to reach academic literature. And in this paper, we identify the factors that explain the price growth of real estate in Russia. And this is this contribution to these factors to price dynamics based on vector after regression models. Fluctuation in house prices have a huge macroeconomic consequences, and this is exactly what the global economic crisis of 2008 shown, when the real estate market turned out to be one of the most important channels of influence of traditional structural shocks of the dynamics of macroeconomic variables. In addition, real estate market is a serious independent source of macroeconomic instability. Interest rates are by variety the most important determinant of real estate prices in the framework of assets pricing, as well as a factor of affecting the availability of loans. The price of real estate can be considered as the present value of future rental payments. Then, if real interest rates decrease, then the prices of real payments increases. And if we abstract from depreciation rates and the cost of maintaining real estate, then with unchanged price and falling interest rates, the price of real estate should increase. In addition, the expected present value of future rental payments should be equal to the return of alternative investment with a comparable level of risks. A number of works are devoted to analysis the contribution of dynamics of real estate's real interest rates to real estate pricing. For example, in one work has been proven that the cyclical behavior of housing pricing and that low interest rates precedes peaks in real estate price several years ahead. And a similar study was conducted a little bit earlier using a simple asset price ratio. Change in house prices can be fully explained by change in real exposed interest rates. And recently, more and more literature about the impact of oil price shocks on the value of real estate. And in our work, we also highlight such shocks separately because Russia is a major oil exporter, and which means that macroeconomic variables depends on the state of the oil product market. We used quarterly data for 20 years and to specification that contains real oil prices as an exogenous variable and lists of endogenous variables like real interest rate, house market price index, and of course real GDP. And all our models we used only second house price index because just results are the same, and of course seasonal cleared if needed. And first, we consider the simplest of our model with inclusion of real estate, real interest rate, and real interest rate, and real estate price index as endogenous variable, and we'll also include the price of Brent oil on the model as an exogenous variable. We can use the model slide, and to identify structural shocks in our model, we use a classical collective decomposition, which can order the impact of shocks by exogenous, and the order of variable is follow oil prices, the real interest rates, and the real estate price index. As for impulse response function, we can see that in response to the positive the response to the positive shock of real interest rate, the real estate price index is decline, which is consistent with with our literature review. And the reaction of index is significant, reaching peak by fourth quarters. The sensitivity of the house market to the interest rates can be interpreted as follow. Since households are limited in borrowing, in the amount of possible, it's like amount of possible credit, an increase in the availability of loans due to decrease in interest rate will lead to increase in house prices because of the increased demand for house. But during positive real interest rate shock, the situation is just reversed. As for historical decomposition, black line indicates the deviation of each mean of time series from its unconditional average, and the real estate price are highly sensitive to oil price shocks for almost a whole time period. The period up to 2009 is described by the greatest volatility of growth rates of real estate prices, which is also explained by the shocks of oil prices. And this shock explained an average of the change as the variable just for 5%. Consistently high oil prices in 2011-2012 had an increasing impact on the real estate price index, but in 2017-2019 the situation has changed because stable oil prices with almost zero growth rates have led to the fact that influence has faded and the shock has ceased to have an impact. Low interest rates in the pre-crisis period of 2006-2007 led to increased demand of the mortgage lending market due to increasing availability of loans, and accordingly led to an increase in the demand in the real estate market. Therefore, almost the entire growth of real estate price index explained by shocks of demand for real estate. And during the period of high interest rates in 2014-2016, the situation has changed, and the shocks of demand for real estate has particularly no effect on the change of house price index. We cannot say the sharper rise in 2020 is explained by the shocks of demand for real estate, but we cannot say that it was because of the low mortgage rates or just because in this year the supply of housing has also decreased by 10%, and in general the multi-directional influence of these factors led to increase in house price index. And to identify causal relationships, it's necessary to use another econometric approach, and we cannot say it. But we constructed a second model, and we just add GDP to our list of endogenous variable as a significant income factors, and as we can notice from historical decomposition, the new added variable did not change our results, and we get this good quality of the first model. And its main factor of price changes in the real estate market before 2010 was the shock of oil prices, and all macroeconomic variables in Russia depending on the state of global oil market and especially real estate market. And as for real shocks of real interest rates and housing demand have of course an increased impact, and they explain the sharp increase in prices over the past years. Thanks for your attention. I cannot hear you.
Laura, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I was thanking Natalia for her presentation and for staying time. Maybe we have 1 minute for a question if there's some questions from the floor. If not, we can directly leave the floor to Flavio, who is our third speaker. And Flavio is talking about Airbnb and the house prices in Italy now. Flavio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see the slides and hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Flavio Pino, and I'm going to present you my joint work with Raffaele Congiu and Laura Rondi titled Airbnb and the Housing Market in Italy, Evidence from 6 Cities. So, Airbnb history in recent years has been a history of great success. They've reached over 800 million guests, and in 2019, they've reached almost $5 billion in revenues. But this rising popularity also came with a rise in concerns by a variety of stakeholders. First and foremost, the accusation that they do unfair competition against the traditional accommodation market, but then also concerns regarding Airbnb presence accelerating the gentrification process as city centers becomes more and more tailored for tourist needs and not citizens' needs. And also the fact that the accusation that Airbnb actually drives up the rents and also the house prices in the city where it is present. Regarding this last point, there is a little but growing causal evidence of the link between Airbnb diffusion and house prices and rental prices. Here I've put you some of the literature regarding both European cities and American cities. But as of now, there are no studies for the Italian market. And this is pretty interesting because Italy is actually the fourth largest market for Airbnb with over 600,000 listings. And moreover, we have very peculiar situations like Florence and Venice, where Airbnb diffusion is at an all-time high, and the cities are trying to pass some citywide regulation to try and reshape how Airbnb diffuses inside the cities. So what do we do in our paper? We focus on 6 Italian cities that are pretty heterogeneous for their position, for their size, for the level of tourist attraction, and also for the seasonalities of the tourist flows. And want to assess the impact of the Airbnb diffusion on sale prices and rents overall, so across cities, but also by city and within the cities, so by distinguishing the effect between the city centers and the suburbs. I also want to point out that as opposed to the United States, in Italy, usually middle and upper class families live in the city center, while low-income families live in the suburbs. And we do so with a pretty robust methodological framework that I'll explain in detail as we go. So regarding the data, we have divided our 6 cities in 301 neighborhoods. And for each neighborhoods, we have data on a trimester level for both the housing prices and the rental rates. Regarding Airbnb data, we have a pretty detailed data set from AirDNA, which was composed by daily scrapes. And so for each dwelling on Airbnb, we can know exactly if it was active and if it was occupied in a given period. Regarding control variables, we use 2 main sources. The first one is from the Italian Observatory of the Housing Market that gives us some time-varying controls regarding real estate stock characteristics. So, for example, the density of houses and stores in a given zone and the average size of the houses. And also we use some time invariant controls given by the 2011 Italian census data that gives us some information regarding demographics, education, and occupation of a given zone. Last, we also use an instrumental approach that I'll talk to you in detail later. Just note that we use data from Google Trends and also from the top 150 attraction for each city taken by TripAdvisor. So just a quick look at the descriptives. There are 3 things that I want to point out. The first one is that, as we can see, between 2015 and 2019, Airbnb increased its presence in Italy, both in listings and in the density. Second thing to point out is that the distribution of the density is very skewed towards what we call the high Airbnb density zones, which are the last decile of the distribution. So there is a stark differences between the average zone and the high density zones, which are usually in the city center for our Italian cities. And finally, there are enormous differences within cities. As we can see, for example, by analyzing 2019 in the high density zones, the high density zones in Turin have around a 3% density of Airbnb, whereas in Florence, we have between 27 and 28%, so a 10-time fold in Florence with respect to Turin. So our data set is actually extremely heterogeneous through the cities. So regarding the methodology, we want to investigate the effect of Airbnb intensity on both the sale and the rent prices in a given neighborhood at a given time. We measure Airbnb intensity by Airbnb density, lagged by 1 period to assess any simultaneity concerns. And then, of course, we introduce some time-varying controls and the temporal fixed effects, both at the trimester and city level to take into account seasonality, and at the year and city level to take into account trends or shocks that have occurred in a given city. We do also one-way and two-way clustering to account for special correlation, and we estimate the model through OLS, through fixed effects, and also through the 2 stages least squares with an instrumental approach. Our results that I'll show you in a bit are robust to a series of extensions that we tried. For example, we tried to change our variable of interest from Airbnb density to the number of listings, or we tried changing the controls that we were using from the Italian Observatory of the Housing Market. And we also tried a dynamic panel approach, since usually house prices are pretty sticky through time, because usually dwellings are evaluated through comparison, and so there is a high correlation between the past prices and present prices, and all of this extension confirm the results that we find. The last theory part, I want to explain a bit our instrumental variable. So of course, there were some endogeneity concerns when analyzing this link between Airbnb's present and the housing prices. So we also use an instrument approach, in particular a shift share instrumental variable in line with previous literature. So we have a shift component, which is the number of global searches of Airbnb on Google. We use the worldwide search in order to avoid any local shocks or trends. And this measure is a proxy of Airbnb intensity, since it represents how much people are aware of the presence of the platform. Regarding the share component, we use a tourist attractiveness score that we compute based on the top 150 attractions for each city that we study. So we take the top 150 attractions. For each of that, we also scrape the number of reviews of that attraction, and then we calculate a score for a given zone in the city by weighting those attractions based on the distance from that specific zone. We also tried as an extension an alternative share component based on the top 10 attractions by Lonely Planet, which is a pretty famous paperback guide that is mostly used in Italy and the European Union, and the results were still confirmed also by this alternative instrument. We've also run a placebo test for account for any spurious time trends. So how the placebo test works is that you scramble data between zones. So you attach the wrong, let's say, tourist attractiveness scores to a zone, and you run the estimation again. We did this for 5,000 iterations. And the insight behind is that if you still find some significant coefficients, it means that your model is not able to capture some important information regarding some time trends or omitted variables, because since you scramble the data, you should not find significant effects. And luckily, all of our cities pass the placebo test. The only concern we have is with the city of Turin, which passes the test, but with not so much high grades. So what are the results? We find that there is a positive and significant impact of Airbnb density on the housing prices. We're called that we measure Airbnb density against the logarithm of sales. So an increase of 1 point percentage, for example, by looking at column 2, an increase of 1 point percentage of Airbnb density increases the sale prices by 0.63%. To translate this in money, an increase of 1 standard deviation, so 4 percentage points of density, increases the average sale prices of around 60 euros per square meter. Interestingly, we do not find any significance regarding the rental prices, but this could also be linked to the fact that rents are usually more prone to shocks that are very specific to the cities. So what we did next was to split the analysis between the cities. And again, we find a strong, significant and positive impact of Airbnb on the housing market, so on the sale prices, except for Venice, where we suspect that there is a problem of oversaturation, both of the Airbnb market and the traditional supply market, as it's very difficult to expand the housing supply in Venice, as you may well know for geographical reasons. And we find also some evidence of positive impact on the rental side, but there are few and far between. We find some positive evidence in Florence and in Naples. We also find a negative and significant coefficient for Turin in the rental market. This is, of course, not a problem. It could be explained, for example, by negative externalities given by Airbnb. For example, an increase of Airbnb in a zone can bring more tourists. That can be a nuisance to residents, and so the rental prices in that zone are driven downwards. But as I was saying before, we are pretty concerned that our model is not able to fully capture the dynamics of the housing market in Turin, since the placebo test was on the verge of not being passed by the city of Turin. Finally, we also split the cities between suburbs and city centers, and we can see that Airbnb has a positive impact both on the suburbs and on the city centers. So there is no compensation effect. Let's say the Airbnb increases the sale prices in the suburbs and in the city centers. Of course, the relevance and also the magnitude of these coefficients vary greatly between suburbs and between city centers. While the coefficients are very different, you also have to take into account that the starting level of Airbnb density is very different. So, for example, in Florence, in the suburbs in Florence, the average density is around 5%, whereas the city center is attested around 20%. Finally, we also wanted to make another analysis to understand whether an increase of Airbnb in the city center positively or negatively affects the suburbs, so a cross effect. To do so, we treat each city center of each city as a whole, and we run again the estimation only on the suburbs to assess the effect of an increase of Airbnb in the suburbs on the suburbs and an increase of Airbnb in the city center on the suburbs. And what we find is actually pretty interesting is that an increase of Airbnb in the city center negatively affect prices in the suburbs. This means that an increase of Airbnb in the city center exacerbates the already existing differences that there are between the suburbs and the city centers. So, of course, as of now, our data set does not allow us to study relocation effects or gentrification effects because we cannot actually see the people flows, the citizen flows. But what we find interesting is that this could hint at a start of a gentrification process, in the sense that as the city center becomes more and more tailored for the tourist needs and the prices in the city centers go up, as of now we find a stark difference between the city center and the suburbs that has been exacerbated by Airbnb. But we think that in the future this could also lead many residents to leave the city centers and to transfer to the suburbs, leading then to an increase of prices in the suburbs. So to sum up, we find strong evidence of a significant positive impact of Airbnb, especially on the housing prices, and some evidence also on the rental prices. The effect varies greatly across and also within the city, both in terms of relevance and size. And we find some exploratory evidence of a negative impact on the suburbs of Airbnb's diffusion in the city center. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Flavio. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions from the floor. If there is no questions, I would have a question for Flavio. You find very different results for the different cities. Sometimes they are opposite results. Have you thought about some common trends about clustering in some way the cities so as to explain these opposite signs?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part because I've lost you?
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
Now I can hear you.
You find very opposite results for the different cities with opposite signs. Have you thought about some common trends that could explain these differences, or have you thought about clustering the cities about some feature, I don't know, to explain the differences between the cities?
Okay, so actually the results that we find are somewhat consistent in the positive signs. The only, let's say, problems that we find are with Turin and sometimes with Naples. We're trying to, as of now, explore the possibility that these negative prices occur due to some negative externalities. So, for example, we are trying to study the overall rotation of tourists in the Airbnb dwellings with the hypothesis that if tourists on average stay just a couple of days in a given Airbnb property, the nuisance that they create to residents is higher. As of now, we've not tried to cluster different cities together, also because the seasonality of the tourism, apart maybe from for Florence and Venice, which could have similar seasons, are pretty different in the other cases. For example, Naples is the only city on the seaside in our sample because, well, we do not count Venice as a seaside destination, let's say. And also Rome has different seasonal events, as well as Milan, for example, with the Fashion Week. So we could try maybe to merge, let's say, Florence and Venice, but yeah, we could try. It would probably cause some problems for the instrumental variables, but maybe we can surpass them in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any questions for any of the speaker from the floor? Thank you all for listening, for staying in this session. I wanted just to say that there is a keynote. The keynote speaker will be on channel 1, so you have to switch the link that you receive on the email to listen to the keynote with talking in 10 minutes. Okay, so I don't see any questions on the chat. So thank you everyone, and see you later.
Okay, we know. But I couldn't see so far Marco Magnani. Is that just that it escaped my... Maybe he will tune in later, but our first speakers are around. Dmitry Dagayev and Anastasia Saltikova. Okay, that's good. And Laura too. So I think we are ready to start in a minute. I just wanted to say good afternoon to everybody. I try to keep strictly to the 15 minutes. So if you want to have a little bit of a chance for a question or discussion, you may want to stop a minute earlier or so. But otherwise, I guess most of the discussion has to be postponed to the very end, when we have, I think, almost 20 minutes of discussion time, if you're all around and still interested in talking about that. Okay, so according to my Central European time, it's now 10 past 10, which is probably 10 past 2 in Perm. And I would open the session, say welcome to everybody, and pass on immediately to Dmitry Dagayev.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I extremely apologize for the possible noise during the presentation, because for the first time in 60 years, they decided to clean the walls of my house, and well, I can't do anything with that. Okay, so let us start.
Can you share your screen?
Yes. Do you see my presentation now?
Yes, I see, but you may want to turn it on to full screen.
Since this is a PDF file, I think it is not possible.
Okay.
So this is our joint research with Sofia Paklina, James Reed, and Carl Singleton. And the motivation for this research comes from our general interest in football and sports, because when we watch football and we see biased decision of referees, we are, well, unhappy about that. But more important, if we can identify some behavioral bias, then we can deal with that, and we can suggest some policies how to get rid of the bias. The famous example comes from the National Basketball Association, when in 2010, Price and Wolfers identified that NBA referees are biased towards players with the opposite skin color. And NBA were worried about that, and they introduced a special program to deal with this bias. They introduced some seminars and courses for referees. And several years later, Pope, Price, and Wolfers analyzed once again the decisions of the referees, and they made the conclusion that the awareness reduced the referee bias. So in our case, we deal with the so-called post-communist legacy, and we want to analyze whether this legacy leads to some behavioral biases in international football. Okay, so our results contribute to three domains of the literature. The first one is, well, the sports economics literature, and there is a ton of literature about the referee bias, which is caused by home advantage, social pressure from the fans, and other reasons. Okay. The second
may I ask a question just for understanding? How do you measure the bias? I don't know these studies. What is the usual way to measure a bias in referee behavior?
Yes, usually they calculate the number of punishments, I mean yellow cards, red cards, penalties, and they study whether the home side is favored by the referees.
In an empirical study, yes, over time.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Another possible variable of interest is the number of added minutes to the match.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
That's
so
okay.
there are different ways to study the bias. Okay. So the second set of the literature is the general economic psychology literature on in-group and out-group bias. Well, this phenomena when the evaluators are biased towards the out-group people is very well documented in this literature. For a detailed review, I refer the reader to Houston et al. And moreover, political and cultural similarity between nations is also a significant predictor of the out-group or in-group evaluation score. And this effect was documented by Henderson King and her co-authors. But in contrast to most laboratory settings, international football provides a high-stakes competitive environment where the referees, the evaluators, make decisions that can affect their future careers. That is, it is a really high-stakes decisions because referees are well paid at the international level, and mistakes that they make can affect their future careers. So these are not just games for $100 as many experimental economics do, yes. And the treated groups, the national teams here in this environment compete with each other. So there are no incentives to misrepresent the evaluations here, yes. So all agents here are incentivized, okay. And finally, I want to refer to the political science literature, which documents that the experience of growing up and living in a communist state affects various aspects of individual decision-making. I mean, civic participation and voting behavior, and moreover, not only just the fact of living in a communist state affects it, but also the legacy of the post-communism affects the decisions even the decades later. Okay, so that is why we are interested in these international relations, in the possible international relations bias. And to deal with this question, we collected the data set from the international football. We collected the set of matches by men's senior football teams between 2002 and 2016. These were competitive matches, excluding final tournaments, because usually final tournaments are played in neutral venues, okay? And we keep only such pairings that at least 2 matches were played in these pairings, okay? And we collected the data on match location, type of the match, and attendance data. And we also classified all countries, all 51 European countries, into 2 blocks: post-communist countries and non-communist countries. The criteria is that is the 40-year history of communism. If a country had at least 40 years history of communism government, then we classified this country as a post-communist country. Therefore, we have 6 indicators that cover all possibilities of the relationships between the home side, the away side, and the referee. The first one is when the home team and the referee is from the same block, and the other two are when referee is from the post-communist state and the home side is from non-communist state, and when the referee is from the non-communist state and the home side is from post-communist state. And the second possible classification is when the away team and the referee come from the same block. The second and the third group in that case are quite similar. The referee is post-communist, away team is non-communist, and referee is non-communist, away team is post-communist. Okay, so here are sample descriptives. Nothing unusual. These numbers indicate the home advantage. Yes, home sides have more wins. They are awarded less yellow cards, they are awarded less red cards, and they get more penalties. Okay, so the standard statistics. Overall, we have more than 1,000 matches in our data set and almost 500 referees. And here are our 6 variables of interest according to the classification of post-communist status, Iron Curtain status. Okay. Here is the distribution of yellow cards. We will be especially interested today in the yellow cards because they appear more often in football matches compared to red cards and penalty kicks. And this distribution can be approximated by Poisson distribution. Therefore, we will implement Poisson models for yellow cards. Okay, and here is our empirical strategy. So we are interested in the expected outcome of the game. Yes, we include in our model the variables of interest Z, which are those post-communist statuses. We also included some control variables and fixed effects in the right side of the equation. So the variables of interest are in the vector Z. They are those indicators, dummy variables that reflect the relationships between the referee and the team playing home or away. For example, the referee is from a post-communist state and the team is from non-communist state. Okay, we excluded the categories when the referee and the home team or the referee and the away team are from the same side of the Iron Curtain. Okay, and this is a referenced group in our estimations. The variables of outcomes are the match result, the goal difference, the indicator of a red card, the indicator of a penalty kick, and the number of yellow cards awarded to the home side and the away side. Okay, the control variables in our estimations are the ELO ranking of a team, the attendance, the distance traveled by the referee to the match, and we approximated it by the distance between the capitals of the states of the referee and of the home side. We included here fixed effects to address any potential trends in match outcomes. And we also included no, that's it. Okay, that's it.
Right.
Okay. And here are the results of our estimations. So, as you can see, our variables of interest are non-significant if we are interested in the result of the game and the goal difference. However, if we look at the number of yellow cards awarded by the referee to the home side and to away side, here we come to the significant variables at least at 10% level. It seems that when a referee is from post-communist state and when home side is from the non-communist state, the referee favors the home side. So this is a rare example of the out-group behavioral bias, not in-group bias, yes, but out-group bias. So it seems that there is a kind of post-communism regret, yes, when the referee comes from the post-communist state, it favors the home side from the non-communist state. And there is no bias in the other direction. So this is very specific. Also, it seems that the bias decreases when we deal with the whole data set compared to the early matches in our data set before 2010. So in this case, the bias is even larger. So it seems that this bias decreases with time, and probably this is due to the increasing professionalism of football referees in Europe, or due to the fact that the memory of living in the communism state decreases over time. Okay. In case of red cards, this bias is much lower, and there is no such bias if we look at the penalty kicks decisions. Okay, so here are our conclusions. Referees from post-communist states appear to favor non-bloc countries in yellow cards and less in red cards. There is no evidence of favoritism in the other direction. And another interesting observation is that this bias decreases over time. These are our main conclusions. It seems that I'm out of time, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. But given our tight schedule, actually, I should say, not being a football or soccer fan, you know, I would have some questions, but we have to probably postpone them to the end. And I think in the interest of time, we should continue now with our next speaker and maybe discuss some of the questions a bit later.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. And could you please leave the screen? Yeah. So our next speaker on the program would be Anastasia Saltykova, and she will talk on influence of intrinsic motivation, mood, and task type on work efficiency. And I see this screen is already shared. So Anastasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Nice to meet you. My name is Anastasia. I would like to present our research in the sphere of behavioral economics. We will talk about motivation, mood, and work efficiency. So, how are you feeling? Are you feeling happy or good? What will you do when you need to complete a difficult task? To do or not to do? If you want to start, you should do it. Will you continue or not? We will talk about these questions. So, what about the theoretical basic concept of this sphere? Here you can see that there are so many articles about mood, for example, about investment mood and financial markets, and so on. So if you can see, positive moods increase overconfidence, greater cooperation, if you can see. And what about the motivation? Basic type of motivation is approach to achieve something or withdraw motivation to avoid. And there are some models that combine connect mood and motivation together. So in this research, we answer the following research question about efficiency, work efficiency. So how does intrinsic motivation affect the work efficiency? Does the mood affect the work efficiency or not? Is there some joint effect of mood and intrinsic motivation? How do people react to complexity of a task? We try to check it on the dataset provided by our colleagues. So we have more than 1,500 responses in experiment in 2015. Respondents are randomly allocated to 3 groups. Neutral, it's a control group, and investment and color group is a treatment group. Investment group faces with investment framed questions. The other treatment group, color, faces with usual questions but with bright colors, green, red, yellow on the black background. Control group faces the questions in black on a white background. At the beginning of the experiment, the respondents were asked to evaluate their mood and motivation. So the percentage of those who completed the survey in the investment group is lower than with the total sample. And so we can see that what about the mood? In the sample, there are only 6% in a bad or rather bad mood. It can be assumed that people in a bad mood prefer not to do anything, don't want to take a survey at all. Next, it is a whole histogram here. And what about motivation? Respondents were asked to choose 2 options from this presented in the table, which describe their current motivation. In this research, we wanted to test the effect of altruistic behavior. It is some activity associated with disinterested concern about others around. Among this type of motivation, 2 can be qualified as altruistic behavior. Is I want to help you collect the data, and I want online service to make a contribution to a charity of my choice. So what about the methodology? We look at model. It is binary dependent variable describing a completeness of the task. So 1, complete the task to the end, 0, all the tasks. And the independent variables characterizing the altruistic behavior, mood, complexity, and so on. So in fact, we used several variables in one regression. So results I will show you next slide. So actually, altruistic behavior is not statistically significant in this case. So we use altruistic behavior. We choose 2 type of motivation. Is I want to help you collect data you need, and I want online service to make a contribution to a charity of my choice. So we try to use this type of motivation in regression. So we can see that only motivation charity variable. So I want to online service to make a contribution to the charity of my choice is statistically significant in this case. So we use good or rather good mood as a dummy because according to the histogram at the beginning of the presentation, we have only 6% respondents in a bad mood. The mood effect hasn't been proven here. It also joint effect, it is this variable and this have not been proven. But the complexity of the task as a variable is statistically significant. To conclusion, we can see that most of those who left the test belong to the investment group. If we interpret investment as complexity, when we can assume that people tend to stop completing a task if it seems too difficult for them. This type of motivation is already said. Comparing with the total sum and complete the task more often. This hypothesis, we will analyze whether the hypothesis can be confirmed or not. So we are continuing to this research and work on this data set. So we will try to use also all the control variables that we have. Currently, we don't have such opportunity, so we will continue to work. It's a very interesting topic, I should say. So thank you for your attention. Please,
Thank you, Anastasia. We still have a couple of minutes for questions and comments. Are there any from the audience?
Anastasia, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm interested in the dependent variable. What was it? Work efficiency, how did you measure it?
It is a binary dependent variable. So if a respondent completed the task, answer all the questions required is 1.
He or she is efficient. It means that it is not categorical variable.
No.
Okay. And I was just curious, you have used in the title intrinsic motivation. What do you understand under intrinsic motivation and how do you interpret it by the variables?
Intrinsic motivation, why you decide to do something. There are many types of kind of motivation. We use this. So it is intrinsic motivation to help, intrinsic motivation to online service to make a contribution to a charity, to give something from the survey, to just because it's curious. So it is all types of intrinsic motivation. It is not just something external.
But you could be only intrinsic or not intrinsic. There was no other option. So any other variable was treated as non-intrinsic.
Actually, intrinsic motivation is we understand in this research actually altruistic behavior. Because
that's a different thing, yeah.
Yes. We just take only this type of motivation represented here. If you are altruistic, you would like to help would like to do something for others. So how we can measure it? We just choose this type of motivation represented here in the table and test. So in general, we can see that only this type of motivation about charity is statistically significant. It is more
in that sense, this is only my comment and advice. Be more precise. What do you understand under intrinsic motivation? Because this is a classical definition in management by DC. In the middle of the 20th century, it was made. Okay.
Okay, I'll take it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? I don't see any. So maybe we move on to our next speaker. And the next topic is presented by Laura Abradri, and she will talk about gentle hosts, attitude, and on Airbnb performance sentiment analysis. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, this is a joint work with Elisabetta Raxè and Laura Rondi. We were colleagues of mine at Polytechnic of Turin. And in this paper, we look at the Airbnb platform, and we study how the host behavior and this kindness can bias the ratings left by reviewers, and in the end, the demand for the listing. Why Airbnb? Because in Airbnb, Airbnb is an accommodation platform, and people go and live at the home of somebody else. Sometimes they live with the host. So they may establish very human personal interactions with the host. And in the end, they may suffer psychological bias. So when they leave the review, the rating is biased. And this may bias also and affect also the demand for a listing. And the problem is important because ratings are the backbone of digital platforms. So if they are biased, they may send a signal that is not reliable. In this paper, we ask if the host is kind, can this kinder attitude by the host bias the ratings left by reviewers? And when I say bias, I really mean a mistake, a distortion. I mean, it's not like just the host is kind, so he correctly deserves a higher rating and a higher demand. I am saying that if the host is kind, he gets a rating that is too high relative to what he deserves, he correctly, objectively deserves. And then we ask, is the host kind attitude, does the host kind attitude has an effect on the demand for the listing? And finally, we go and see whether the host kindness can mitigate the negative effect of some flaws of the listings, such as its bad location. We develop a text analytics algorithm to read the comments left by reviewers in the platform. And then we measure the host kindness and see the impact on ratings and on demand. Why Airbnb? Well, in Airbnb, a lot of ratings have 4 or 5 stars. That is the maximum. And so the literature has suggested that there is a bias. The ratings are very skewed. And the reason for this skewness is being attributed to psychological biases. So the reviewer is biased when he leaves the review because he wants to reciprocate, for example, the host kindness. And the literature has also suggested that the host behavior plays a key role in leaving a good review. So we try to quantify the host kindness and to quantify the effect of this kindness on ratings and on demand. So to prove the size of the bias. We use data on the city of Barcelona in 2019. We read the comments of more than 600,000 reviews. We just focus on entire apartments because they cannot be compared to single rooms. And we have data on the demand for the listing. we proxy demand by the number of reviews left for listings, but also we have data on the occupancy rate, so the rate with which a listing is occupied by guests. We have obviously data on the text of reviews, that is the comment left by reviewers, and we have the review score rating, so the stars left by reviewers. We have a rich set of control variables on the characteristic of departments, like the size, location, its endowments, and so on. We have data about the characteristics of the ad, like the price or the number of photos, and we have data about the host attributes. So we use this data as controls. I want to spend a few words on how we measure the host kindness in our analysis. I said we elaborate the comments of these 600,000 reviews, and from each comment left by each reviewer, we just extracted the sentence that talks about the host behavior. And to do this, we use some keywords like host, owner, staff, and so on. And then we develop three measures of kindness for robustness. The first one is very intuitive, it's the first name, and it's the share of reviews received by a host in which is called by name. And the idea is that if we call by name in a review the host, we establish a friendly, very personal relationship. The second measure is a bit more sophisticated and uses a package of sentiment analysis. And it produces a score, the score seed, that is a number between -1 and 1. So this score gives the sentiment of the review expressed in the review. So a -1 means a very negative sentiment, 0 means a neutral sentiment, 1 is a very positive sentiment. And then we develop our measure of kindness, rank. So we design a machine learning algorithm to develop this variable, and that classifies basically the host behavior in one of 4 classes: negative, neutral, positive, or excellent. So our measure of rank is the weighted average of the frequencies of these 4 classes for every listing and every host. I cannot give you details, obviously, for time of the algorithm. We developed this neural network. I just wanted to say one thing. The main problem of this kind of algorithms is false negatives and false positives. So sentences that a human understands is negative, but it's written in positive terms. And so to show you how our algorithm works, I selected this sentence, for example: after our initial host canceled our trip on the day, Monica was very quick to say we could stay. So this is a sentence that could easily be mistaken by an algorithm as negative because it talks about cancellation, but in reality is positive. And indeed, I wanted to show you that our algorithm correctly classifies it as positive, while the score, the score measure, the sentiment analysis measure, classifies this as close to 0, so almost neutral. So this just wants to show you how this algorithms performs. And the same applies for the following sentence, that our algorithm classifies as positive, while the score so and so, like almost neutral. Before showing to you our results, I have to provide to you some important information on the rating system in Airbnb. First of all, it's a double-blind system, in the sense that the guest and the host write their review about each other and publish it, submit it simultaneously, so before reading the review left by the other. Second feature, there might be a selection bias in the sense that leaving a review is not compulsory, but in Airbnb, most of the trips end up in a review. So most guests in the end leave a review. Third, guests leave a rating, the stars, on the overall experience, plus they leave a rating on 6 different dimensions, such as the cleanliness of the apartment or the location of the listing. Some comments. First, given that there is the rating on the overall experience, there might be potentially no effect of kindness on demand, because if the host is kind, the guest gives a good rating, a 5-star rating, and then the rating has an impact on demand, has an effect on demand. So in principle, there might be no effect of kindness on demand, because this effect is entirely captured by the rating in principle. And this is something that we will go and verify. Second thing, it's very important that we have the rating of location. It will play a very important role in our analysis, because we can measure objectively the quality of the location, since we have the GPS coordinates of the listing. And so we compare in our analysis the rating, our objective measure of location, with the rating left by reviewer, and this allows us to verify whether there is a bias. Another important thing of location is that it should be independent from the host attitude. So if the host is kind, there should be no effect on the rating of location. It should be independent. And finally, the location cannot be modified, is exogenous. It's not like the host looks at his demand, so sees that his demand is low, and then he moves the apartment, okay? So location is an exogenous characteristic of the listings. So the first, these are our results. The first question that we ask is whether kindness produces a psychological bias on the ratings, and we exploit the location rating. Here you see the results in which we show how the kindness of the host has an impact on the rating of location, even controlling for the distance of the listing from the touristic center. So we use the GPS coordinates of our listings to measure its distance from 14 main touristic attractions. And we find that when the host is kind, this kindness has a positive effect on the rating of location, even after we control for its position, for the distance from the center. And this means that there is a psychological bias, because the rating of location should not depend on kindness. So when the host is kind, his bias is creating a bias on the reviewer. As a second step, we go and see the effect of kindness on the demand for the listing. As I said, in principle, there might be no effect, because the effect of kindness on demand may go entirely through the rating, the overall score rating. And what you can see them in the first column, we see that when the host is kind, he gets a higher demand. So the positive kindness on demand is the effect of kindness on demand is positive and significant, even after we control for the rating. So the kindness has a direct effect on demand, even in addition to the effect of a higher rating. We then explore the role of location. So we introduce an interaction term between the kindness and the distance of the apartment from the touristic center. And we find a positive significant coefficient, meaning that the positive effect of kindness on demand is higher the more distant is the listing from the main touristic attractions. So what is the channel here? If the listing is far from the center, it should deserve a lower rating on location, but if the host was kind, the guest feels badly about leaving a bad rating. And so we have a positive effect on demand, especially for more distant listings. We do some robustness checks on other measures of demand. We use occupancy rate. In the paper, we use actually a quadratic form because we saw that kindness has decreasing returns on demand. Obviously, there might be endogeneity issues. In particular, we might have a reverse causality problem in the sense that when the host observes low demand, he may change his behavior and become kinder. So what we are doing in this stage of the work is to calculate the host kindness up to 2019. So freeze the measure of kindness to 2019, and then observe the effect of this kindness on the 2020 demand. We exploit not only the lag, but also the pandemic, because in 2020 there was Barcelona was in a lockdown, so was all closed in the first 6 months. Then everything reopened in mid-June of 2020, and we observe how the host who has been kind in up to 2019 enjoys a premium on demand when he reopens his listing in 2020. And the first results seems to confirm our the results that I show you. Then I think my time is over. Just to conclude, the personal interaction between guests and host may bias the ratings left by reviewers. We use semantic analysis to analyze the Airbnb comments, and we saw that the host kindness creates a bias on the ratings, even on dimensions such as the listing's location that should not depend on the kindness. And this has an impact on demand, especially for the demand when listings are far from the center. So for listings with a bad location. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Laura. And I'm sorry to say, maybe we have time for one question. Stefan Trautmann already raised his hand.
So let me, so I just wanted to point out that the same issue might come up in other contexts, right? So I mean, it's very interesting. So for instance, teaching evaluations or any assessment of employees, right? So if you have a teacher who's not very efficient, it's a bit difficult to assess. I mean, maybe student outcomes, but the person is very kind to the student. This might then affect all these other dimensions that you're, right? So there are typically 20 questions, but some dimensions might flavor all the other dimensions, right? So I think the general principle that you study here goes far beyond these judgments. It means that these questions are not treated separately and then aggregated, but they influence each other. So the aggregate is unclear what to make of the aggregate, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, Laura.
Yes, if I just a few seconds for the reply, you are completely right. So we have implications on the rating systems in general, but in other applications, it's difficult to have an objective measure of the performance. That's why we exploit Airbnb, because with the location, we have an objective measure and we compare it with the subjective measure of the rating. While in other contexts, we may lack the data on the objective performance, the quality, the objective measure of the performance. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And sorry that I have to cut the discussion short. We still have some time at the end, which we can resume some of the issues. But right now we should move on to our next speaker. And we're now moving to Stepan Gogolyev, who may already start to share his screen. And he will talk on benefits and losses of producers from downsizing strategy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, dear colleagues. My name is Stepan Gogolyev, and today I'm going to present our study about analysis of strategy of producers within the context of the downsizing strategy at the FMCG market. And first of all, I would like to move to the phenomenon of downsizing, which we analyze. So, as in a classical literature, we understand downsizing as insignificant decrease in the volume of the product that can be accompanied by changing the price, but not the product characteristics. But in practice, another common situation of downsizing is when not only the volume of the product is decreasing, but also is changing some insignificant minor characteristics like the package of the product. So the literature analyzes all of these effects. And we would like to tie the research to economics and analyze some important results in economic field. So the most important problem is how people should and how people respond to such strategy of producers. And from this point of view, a lot of studies analyze consumer behavior, and they understand how change the elasticity on the product, how change price elasticity on the product, how change elasticity on the volume of the product with implementation of such strategy. And they show different results on different markets. Another big field of researches related to downsizing is psychological researches that analyze different important signals that consumers get after downsizing strategy implementation. And the most important point is that all of these researches are about consumers. But in our study, we would like to shift emphasis from consumer behavior to producer expectations from this behavior. Also, both of these sides of the market can be investigated separately. We would like to combine them and give more attention to producers. So actually, the main question that faced with producer when he or she decided to start downsizing strategy is what will be the response of the consumers? Do they notice the change in volume? And if they, then what will be reaction? Will they stop to buy the product or not? And from this point of view, we can decide three significantly different strategies that can be observed in the market. The first one is when consumers don't notice the change in the volume and they keep their behavior as is before. That's quite hypothetical situation, but it still exists. So in this situation, we see that the consumer choice don't have any changes, and it leads to increased profit from these producers. In other situation, a lot of researchers show what consequences can be observed when consumer notice such change. So consumer should change this behavior, behavior, and there should be difference in further choice. And it means there will be some differences in volume of demand. So the further differences will be depend on the type of demand. Is it elastic or not? Because downsizing in some form is a high form of price increase. So reaction on this will be also different. And we see that depending on the situation, there are different profit changes. But important point is that in FMCG, a lot of demand are elastic. So we can exclude the last, the third situation and analyze only the first two. And the further analysis of literature show us that both of these situations are kind of extreme situations. And the truth is somewhere in between. Because we clearly understand that some consumers really don't do product inspection characteristics every time of the on every purchase, but others do. And to understand for producer, will his profit will be higher or not, there should be some analysis that shows some risks and some possibilities to increase the profit from such strategy. And our task in this context is to propose some model that will explain why in some market we can observe such strategy and why in some cases not. And for this, after some investigations, we proposed such model of line demand bundle lines. So what does it mean? So let's say that the initial demand of the consumer was D1, and there was some equilibrium from the consumer in point 1, and Q0 units were bought by this price. After that, downsizing strategy was implemented. And what does it mean? It means that the same number of units of the product were sold by the higher price per unit, just because there is a lower number of the product in the package. And if nobody at the market don't see any changes, then the new equilibrium in point 2. So it means that consumer moves from the line D1 to the line D2. And this picture exists only in the producer's imagination. And it means that producer can affect on this picture. So for example, what will be the next step? The next step, when some consumers understand that was a trick, and that they buy and that they pay a higher price to the lower product, they move their behavior, they move their choice, and they move to the point of 3. And actually, if we analyze ideal model with complete information, there shouldn't be any point of 2. So people should move from line D1 from point 1 to point 3. But incompleteness of information and some problems with product characteristics expectations creates point of 2. And the task of producer is to understand which revenue additional he can get in point 2 and what he can lose from moving to point 3. And for this, we analyzed in this model from the point of elasticity and revenue and tried to understand, is it in line with some empirical results we get from analysis. For this, we take some scanner data. We analyze sales of juice. We decide this market as it's growing and there's a lot of variety of brands and a lot of producers implementing downsizing strategy in the period we look at. And we decided to see only meal packages, actually from 900 milliliters to 1000. And we have a lot of observations. So I skip this slide. And I just would like to show you the main result of our study is how people change their reaction on the downsizing from time to time. So horizontal axis show the number of weeks after the downsizing strategy was implemented, and vertical axis show the revenue effect scaled in some way. So what does this figure shows? It shows that in the first number of some weeks, effect of revenue is positive. And moreover, it has some statistical significance. It's statistically significant. But after some number of weeks, this effect is negative. And it means that in every next week, the company or the producer get lower and lower revenue that he could get if he didn't implement downsizing strategy. And important result from this is to understand what's the reason of such change in attitude to the brand, and why producers implement downsizing strategy if they understand that positive reaction is only this part, but negative reaction in this part. And actually, at this plot, our chosen brand is lost some money because he loses a lot of revenue. So the same picture, but in this plot, what we see that in the first weeks, the revenue of producer is increasing. The reason is that consumers keep to purchase the same number of units, and with the higher price per unit, it leads to the increase of the revenue. And also it can be observed using elasticity. So when we move to the point of 3, we can change how elasticity was changed. And the results with revenue and with elasticity are in line with this plot. And it gives us some beliefs that our models try to give some important results about consumer behavior. So the main result of our study actually is the model we proposed and try to validate it in some ways. After this, we find quite important result about that the first 4 weeks downsizing give positive revenue effect in comparison if the producer don't implement downsizing strategy. And actually, the first step of our research can be to analyze the reasons why 4 weeks, and will this number will change from market to market, and how it depends on the type of goods. Is it perishable good or not perishable good? And more complete view on this problem will give us deeper understanding of the phenomenon. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stepan. And thank you for keeping the time, but we have little time left for a question or comment, maybe one, if it's really urgent. Otherwise, I would suggest to do that at the end. Actually, I have a few comments too. If you stay around, at the end, I'm happy to ask them. But right now, I suggest to move on to our next speaker, Marco. Just a second. Persicina, and he will talk.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
I'm sorry, I was not sure. About
okay.
Self-selected intervals in psycho-physic experiments and the measurement of willingness to pay.
Okay.
Well, we see your slides, so the floor is yours, Marco.
Thank you so much. So, well, I'm Marco Persichino from the Center for Environmental Resource Economics in Umeå, Sweden. What that I got to present here is the result of an experiment that involves the willingness to pay for environmental sound improvement in the urban residence area of Stockholm. The main issue that we go to study here is the elicitation methods for the preferences of the responder. Generally, there is 2 methods that are used in the elicitation method when we have to ask for the willingness to pay for some not market goods like environmental protection, something like that. There is a close-on-hand value, so just ask for a precise value, or an open hand. What did we go to investigate here is the capability of asking for an interval that include the willingness to pay to capture the real preference of the responder. In the literature, there is several are uncertainty about which is their real preferences. When we ask them for a precise value, just for a value, tendency there is several bias that affect the answer, like anchoring effect, focal point, and so many others. So one of the main issues in the contingent evaluation literature is the elicitation method. So how we can effectively pose a question that give to us an answer that is respondent to the belief of people. And there is some element that suggests that just don't give any fixed value, but let them free to define interval can improve the quality of the data, because can reduce the uncertainty that you have when you ask for a precise value. We choose to investigate these things using the sound. One use of the sound. There is an important work from Harriet Oder in the literature that show that people generally, when they don't experience something, they have not a pre-existence value, which are their preferences. So they need to experience something to be in the condition to provide evaluation. So we choose to create this this experiment in which we use psycho-physic labs, a really realistic framework in which the people were listening to sound for more time. One, it was a quiet environment. Another one, it was a noisy environment that was the typical traffic urban noise that there is in Stockholm. And we asked them how much they were able to pay, like monthly fee, to improve the quality in their living room, switching from the noisy environment to the quiet environment. Of course, we do practice trial before. We randomize the scenario we proposed to them with some other scenario, and we analyzed 5 main scenarios. It was an increasing of 5 decibel each one. Of course, people can listen more and more time, the sound, to be sure about the answer, and so on. We asked them essentially to provide in Swedish kronos a realistic amount about their willingness to pay. The scenario was really realistic because we were in psycho-physic labs with several sound speakers that recreate a realistic situation. Substantially, so they listen for in 2 different days, several times different couple of noise, and we focus over 5 specific sound. The decibel was 40, 45, 50, 55, and 60. The main question were 2. When we use this methodology to ask them to provide an interval with a minimum and a maximum, they include the willingness to pay, we are able to capture a dose-response relationship between the object of the evaluation, in our case, the sound, the noise, and their willingness to pay, so how much I'm able to pay to reduce this noise. So the interval captured this relationship, and then the length of the interval, they sometimes consider it like a measure of uncertainty about the value, because if we have for a value interval, we have to suppose that people are more uncertain about the value. Is independent from the sound per se. This is really important, it's shown in the paper, because when we do these kinds of elicitation, we need to assume the true telling condition. So we need to assume that people say what they believe. In the paper I will not show you here, but in the paper we show that if the length of the interval is affected directly by the sound per se, so from the psychophysical condition, we are not able to assume the true telling condition, because we need that the answer that they give to us are affected just by their own preferences and not from the psychophysical condition given by the sound. So we checked for these 2 hypotheses. I anticipated that both our hypotheses are verified because effectively the interval show that there is a dose-response relationship. So okay, that means that increasing the sound, they are able to pay more, and show that the sound per se doesn't affect their evaluation. So we had a really large sample, including in the sample more than 3,400 observations. More than 500 were of the 5 specific increasing sound that we had adopted. first things, we didn't find any linear effect because we didn't have any correlation between the length of the interval and the repetition of the trial. This gives generally when people are unused with some kind of question, they tend to having a linear effect. So the precise the evaluation with the decreasing of the repetition. We didn't have this linear effect, so we have to suppose that effectively people were quite used to listen noisy traffic noise sound. And this is an element that was important because to reduce the uncertainty, we want to use some sound that was not new for the people, so something that they were used, so they was possible provide a realistic evaluation. We found, I show really rapidly here, a dose-response relationship. So we can see that the minimum of the interval, also the maximum of the interval increase over the scenario. We have five scenarios. The scenario 1 is that the scenario with the lower sound noise, the scenario 5 with the higher. So we have in this graph, we can visualize that effectively people are able to pay more when the noise became higher. So they are able to pay more to reduce this noise. But of course, we do econometric analysis for this. And we considering that the midpoint like measure of their willingness to pay. We show formally why the midpoint is because when we assume uniform distribution over the lengths, the midpoint represents the expected value that they have. And the midpoint increase with the increase of the noise. And what we observe also is that instead the length of the interval is not affected from the sound per se. But we observe a correlation between the length of the interval and the size of the interval. So this is an idea, another result that we have. So the main determinant of the length of the interval is the magnitude of the willingness to pay. So as big as is the willingness to pay, as much increase also the length of the interval. Here we can see our statistical analysis. We test a different model because we include in our regression the midpoint that is representative of the willingness to pay, is square, the sound level, and also the interaction between midpoint and sound level. How we can see the only variable that is significant in all the model is the midpoint. And also the ANOVA test show that the model that better predict the length of the interval is the regression in which the only variable is the midpoint. When we go to see also the R square of our econometric analysis, we see that we have really good R square, 0.7. So it's effectively our model explicates really well the result. Also, if you go to see visually that one that is the analysis of the residual, we see the cuckoo plot that's really well designed. There is not a pattern in the graph for residual versus fitted. And we also tested the linear hypothesis over the regression of the coefficient. Even there, we had a really good result. And we also, it's not shown here, we try also to introduce some dummy variable to test if effectively a single scenario could affect the lengths. And also from the analysis that we did with the dummy, we had confirmed our result that the length of the interval is not affected from the psycho-physical condition given from the sound per se, and that the main explicant of the length of the interval is the midpoint. So the evaluation they provide about the hypothetical willingness to pay for this environmental sound improvement. Okay, we go to show, to say roughly the conclusion. To summarize it, we know that in the evaluation literature, one of the main topics and now we are discussing is how we can avoid anchoring effect or some other error, response error bias that we have when generally we ask to people to provide just one number, or when we provide to them a bracket with fixed number that can create some situation of consistent arbitrariness, so they are affected from the value that they observe. The literature proposed to use self-select interval, and we tested this idea to use to ask to them just for the interval with the minimum and the maximum to provide their preferences, and we proved that this method can effectively give to us the answer if about the presence of those response relationships between the object evaluation of the evaluation that they provide. And we also showed that there is not a bias created from the object evaluation, so from the psychophysical condition in our situation, and so we are in the condition to assume the truth-telling condition in when we run a survey using this methodology. So from our analysis, this is the first time this is implemented in the literature, this kind of experiment showed effectively this is a promising method to implement in the contingent evaluation method to solve some problem and some issue that are really present in the literature about anchoring effect or currency arbitrarian. So things that mean really roughly, if there is some a little bit of time for some question, I will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you for being in time. We have time for a question or a comment. Is there anyone, any question from the audience? I can't see all of you, you know, and I don't see raised hands. So thank you, Marco. Again,
thank you so much.
Maybe something comes up after the next talk when we have a longer break, you know, and a little bit more time for discussion.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Our next speaker is Magnani, and he will talk about consumer inertia and firm incumbency in liberalized retail electricity markets in empirical investigation.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone.
Yeah.
I will, yeah, I'm sharing the screen. Can you see now?
Yes, we can see it now. Yeah. You may want to make it full screen, but otherwise it's okay.
Yeah. Can you see now?
Yes, now it's full screen. Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, so consumer inertia and firm incumbency in liberalized retail electricity markets, a paper with Paolo Valbonesi and Massimo Dragotto. Now, liberalization in energy market is undergoing in many countries. At the same time, consumers have a tendency to be disengaged with market dynamics. Of course, these frustrate competition dynamics. In our study, we try to understand what is the role of incumbency in explaining this consumer inertia, so the fact that consumers are not switched from regulated tariffs to free market tariffs or in the free market itself, by focusing on the Italian energy market. In particular, we try to estimate the causal effect between market concentration, which is our proxy for incumbency, and switching rates, which are our proxies for consumer inertia. Of course, it is important to understand what are the factors determining inertia in energy markets. On the one hand, liberalization of energy markets is one of the objectives of the European Union. And the fact that, on the other hand, the fact that competitions can unfold in energy market can lead to better services to consumers and lower prices. And this is, of course, very important also for vulnerable consumers that tend to spend too much for the energy bills because they tend to be more disengaged. Now, in Italy, there are two coexisting retail markets. There is a regulated market where there is a unique contract whose price and conditions are set by the public regulator, the ARERA. And basically, consumers are in the regulated tariffs because they had never made a choice. So it is basically a default choice for them. On the other hand, the free market, where there is a variety of sellers that offer a variety of contracts with different prices, different price structures, and so on and so forth. Being in the free market requires consumers to make an active choice, okay? And in Italy, for households, which is the market we are looking in our paper, the free market opened in 2007, so it's been 14 years now. Consumers can, at no monetary cost, at any time, switch between the regulated and the free market and switching back. And they can also switch within the free market, so they can change a provider or contract with the same provider within the free market. There are no costs associated with the switching. It is important to understand that. Now, in Italy, we can see that the red line is the share of consumers in the free market. The share of consumers in the free market is increasing over time, even if at a quite slow rate. Only a couple of years ago, the majority of consumers were subscribed in free market offers. There is a wide heterogeneity within Italian regions in terms of switching rates to the free market. This map shows indeed that switching rates are nationwide low, but there is heterogeneity across regions. And we will exploit this heterogeneity in our paper because we look at, as a unit of observations, the regions across 4 years. There is heterogeneity also in terms of switching to the free market, subscribing a contract with a firm that is different than the incumbent, because incumbent offers both a regulated offer and free market offers. So switching to a free market offer by subscribing a contract to a firm different than incumbent is a further proof that the consumer might be more informed about market dynamics. Now, switching rates to the free market are low, even if there are opportunities for saving. Indeed, these are data, just a glimpse of data from the public price comparison website. The first row shows the regulated tariff in terms of yearly spending. We can see that there are much cheaper offers from both big and small firms. Switching within the free market might seem low as well, and there is again heterogeneity across Italian regions, as well as for renegotiations, which are switching within the free market but changing only the contract and not the provider. Finally, we can see that nationwide the market is still pretty much concentrated in terms of market shares, but there is again heterogeneity across Italian region. Especially we can see that in the southern regions, market concentration is higher, while it is lower in northern region, with of course some differences in smaller regions like Valle d'Aosta. We will exploit all these differences to estimate our causal links between market concentration and switching. In particular, we will link market structure in terms of concentration indexes and number of firms. So this is our explanatory variables. By looking at 4 different switching rates, which will be our outcome variables. We will look at switching from the regulated to the free market overall, and switching from regulated to the free market to a firm different than the incumbent, which is a subset of the first variable, of course. Then we look at switching within a free market, changing the provider, which is typically known as external switching. And finally, switching within the free market, but changing only the contract, so the renegotiation, which is also called internal switching. We use, again, a panel data set, which we built specifically for this paper, spanning years from 2015 to 2018. This is our estimation model. Our outcome variables are the 4 switching rate I've shown you before. So we will have 4 outcome variables. Then we have basically a vector of concentration indexes. Well, we will have different estimation models for different concentration indexes. And we will add market structure, market characteristics variables, such as the number of firms, and the social demographic variables in the vector Z. For example, average income within the region, the share of citizens with a degree, and the share of internet access, and so on and so forth. Of course, these are variables that were identified in the literature affecting the switching attitude of consumers. We basically have a summary of results in this table, because in a short of time, in such a short time, we couldn't show each regression variable, each regression models. On the one hand, some results were kind of intuitive. For example, we find, these are all significant results, of course, those with negative and positive. We find that we have a negative effect of concentrations on switching from the regulated to the free market. We look at the 4 most used concentration indexes, their final index and concentration ratio of the first, second, well, the first largest firm, the 2 largest firms, and the 3rd largest firms. We find that concentration seems to negatively affect switchings from the regulated to the free market. This is true for both the overall switching and for the switching to firms different than the incumbent. That is that when concentration is high, incumbency is more present in the regions, and these firms prevent their consumer bases to switch to free market offers. They want to retain their consumer base, and therefore they exert market power in depressing, basically, switching to the free market. On the other hand, we find that the number of firms also negatively affect switching rate to the free market, which might look counterintuitive. We explain this with 2 factors. On the one hand, having more firms means that there are more alternatives in the market, and consumers might be confused by the fact that there are so many alternatives, and the choice becomes more complex, more difficult, because there are so many contracts to choose with, that this might disengage consumers. On the other hand, a higher number of firms increases the likelihood of firms to exert unfair market practices, such as call centers or door-to-door practices that might be perceived as dangerous for consumers in some sense, and this might decrease the trust in the free market, and therefore a higher number of firms will lead to lower switching rates. Looking instead at switching rates, the last 2 columns within the free market, we find that concentration leads to a higher switching within the free market, both in terms of changing the provider and changing the contract. We explain this by the fact that when there is high concentration, okay, in regions with high concentrations, consumers tend to switch more to the incumbent. It means that incumbents are, if they switch to the free market, of course, it means that incumbents are good in migrating their consumer bases from the regulated tariffs to the free market tariffs. But this choice might be kind of irrational for consumers. Once they are in the free market and they already experience it, a switching process, they will change more, okay? Because maybe they are dissatisfied with the initial choice, so switching with the incumbent, because it was, let's say, pushed by the incumbent itself rather than the willingness of the consumers. Meaning that when concentration is high, there is a more incentive to switch a second time. So we find a positive effect of market concentration on switching rates. Finally, we find also a positive effect of market concentration on renegotiation, so external, internal switching, that we explain by the fact that at this point, incumbents are willing to offer more aggressive contracts over time to consumers in order to retain their consumer bases. Okay. So this basically explains what I said. Market concentration that are switching to the free market. At the same time, it is associated with higher switching rates within the free market and higher renegotiation. The number of firms, on the other hand, deters switching to the free market, as more firms imply more aggressive marketing and lower trust. Okay. We advocate some policy implications given our results, because in Italy we are experiencing nowadays the phasing out of regulated tariffs. Now, on the one hand, we hope for improved design tools to increase consumer engagement and improve the transition to the free market. So the first implication is to impose stricter criteria to operate in the market in order to avoid unreliable firms. That is that in Italy we have now about 600 energy providers. Our idea is so a higher number of providers we saw in our results that might lead to lower switching rates to the free market. So we advocate for lower number of firms but higher average quality of firms. So stricter criteria to enter in the market. Nowadays, criteria are quite lax. Then we advocate also for improving informational requirements, for example, within energy bills, in consumers that are subscribed to incumbents contracts. Okay, so the idea is that the consumers should be more informed about the opportunities of the free market and the fact that they can also switch to the free market to another firm that is not the incumbent itself. Finally, we look at the auctions because this year the authority allocated business firms to free market providers, those that hadn't changed their contract, so they were subscribed under regulated offers. They were allocated to free market providers by means of an auction mechanism. Basically, the authority identified bidding areas in terms of homogeneous and contiguous regions, Italian regions, using as a criteria delinquency rate. Now,
Marco, you have the time in mind, yeah? Have you?
Yeah. Okay. I just finished. Now, in 2023, regulated tariffs will be phased out for households as well, which means that about 12 million consumers will be allocated to free market providers through an auction mechanism which would be similar to the one used for business consumers this year. In order to identify bidding areas, we suggest the authority to take into account not only delinquency rates to find homogeneous regions, but also concentration indices, because we found in our estimation results that concentrations do have an impact in terms of switching rates. So when designing bidding areas, we suggest that this factor is also taken into account. This way, we might avoid too much concentrated areas, and we have more homogeneous areas in terms of existing concentration in the market. Okay.
Thank you, Marco. And we've now the end of our scheduled talks and more time for discussion. But before we move into this discussion, I'd like to thank all the speakers, in particular as well, for their sticking to the time, which makes it easy for a chairperson. But I would open the discussion now if there are questions on any of the talks we had, Of course, we can start with Marcos if that's still most vividly now on our mind. Are there any questions? Well, Marco, I have one, if I may take the privilege of starting early. with the electricity markets, you know, I always think as an economist, on the one hand, we have a homogeneous product, but since we have liberalization of the market from usually one government provider, the situation has become very complicated. If you have really to choose among many companies and many contracts, you'll find it's far from homogeneous, because different companies usually offer quite different contracts, you know, in terms of parameters, of course. It's no longer the electricity price alone, it is the length of the guaranteed price, the quantity of green electricity included, etc. So it's what we are ending up is, rather from having a unified supplier which has one standard contract, we go to dozens of contracts which are very complicated and hard to compare as well. That's why I think there's something like a setup cost, and we find that in Germany too. Moving from the single provider where one was before into the free market is a kind of setup cost. And then being in the free market, of course, you've already had to scan necessarily some variety of contracts. It's now much easier to switch from one to the other. Yeah. So I think that's something which I thought I've seen reflected in your data as well. Is that true?
Yeah, this is definitely true. And we find also looking at our other research and the data that we have at the authority, we find that those that had switched, they become not all of them, but there is a core of consumers within the free market that switch quite often, and they switch, and they make also good choices in terms of saving. They're able to compare and so on and so forth. They are very active. On the other hand, those that had never switched, they really sometimes they are not even aware that they are in a regulated tariff. They're not even aware there exists a free market to begin with.
Right.
And so yeah.
That's what I meant with setup cost. It's like a big step. Once you've taken it, you know,
right.
The regime changes. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
And actually, in terms of regulation, I thought about that in Germany. I don't know whether that fits exactly to the Italian case, but I thought in competition, it's usually quite good to have standardized products, you know. So I think probably some regulation about what you could include in a contract, yeah, may help to make the market more competitive. That reduces the parameter a consumer has to compare.
Yeah, this is true. Indeed, in the authority last year, we can't constrain business practices and choices of firms, because they must be free to set up the contract as they wish. But what we did in the authority is to standardize how the information is presented to consumers. Right. That should ease the choice and the comparison.
Of course, yeah, of course, makes it easier. But I don't want to dominate the discussion. Are there any other questions on any of the talks we had?
Hello, I want to ask one question to Marco. Could you please just explain a little bit how the market behaves in Italy? I mean, can consumers just choose a company, energy company, from a different region? And if it is the case, did you account it somehow in your model?
Now the market is nationwide in a sense that contracts are sold. So the same contract is sold in each region. Firms can decide to focus on one region, but then of course they can sell consumers in another region. But the market is nationwide, so you don't choose a contract of a different regions. But each region has its own market structure due to the history, institution, and so on and so forth. So the number of firms, for example, that there is in a region with respect to another depends on like historical factors, economic factors, and so on and so forth. But a consumer can choose a contract nationwide, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Well, I still have a few, but I would work backward simply from my list, you know, and I had a question for Stepan Grogolov. Is he still around? I can't see him. Don't have. Yes, Stepan, I see you now. You had this demand function with the packaging or product size constraint. And I was wondering on your theoretical analysis, what is the quantity on your demand function? Are these units, you know, of your say, bottles of orange juice or boxes of orange juice, or are these liters or orange juice quantities? Because otherwise I do not quite understand why the price for you goes up or why you can sell the same quantity at the same price, you know. So what do you mean by the Q on your in your diagrams? Yes, that's not so simple plot, so I couldn't explain it in details. But horizontal axis was shown the quantity in units. So, for example, one box or one box. Okay, one package. That means that the situation as a starting point is a situation where the consumer just counts the boxes of orange juice and not the content, the quantity of the content. Yes. That means, you know, he would not notice a change in price. So how do you come then to do your second demand curve, you know? That's what I was wondering in this case. Yes, so actually that's not a classical demand because the price and quantities were not related. So the price was per volume, but quantity in units. Sorry, I missed it. Price was per quantity unit? Price per liter, for example. Not price for the unit, but price per liter. Okay, okay. And then the increase in price was not just the cost difference, because if you fill less orange juice in a bottle, of course, you have a decrease in cost, you know. That would not affect revenue, but cost, of course. So if you sell the same number of boxes or bottles of orange juice, but you have less content, then of course you have lower costs per bottle. Yes, so the trick is that consumers don't notice these changes, so they think that so yes, actually demand should be like this, but vertical, like this, horizontal. Okay. So the anyway, shouldn't depend on the price. Yes, but such trick allows to get aligned with this such slope. Maybe worthwhile to think about that. I thought this was the part, you know, where I had most problem, you know. On the one hand, you have the empirical data, which is probably in quantity of orange juice sold, not in boxes sold. The empirical data is probably revenue of an industry in terms of the quantity of juice sold. Or is it in boxes? Yes, we analyzed juice, so it was in packages, so there was no such problem. Okay. Okay, that's my question. Are there any other questions from the audience? It's not the case. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Stepan. And I'm taking a lot of time. Yeah, Dima, why don't you take?
I'll take it over from you, Jürgen, then, because I will close the stream A. And my computer here is boiling, and I just would like to thank everyone for taking part in this conference, for the participation. I would like to thank participants for punctuality, because we've managed to hold all the sessions on time, and most talks were within 15 minutes, and that was great to see that. And we had some vivid discussions. I kept an eye on stream B. There were discussions in chat. There were discussions in live, so that was nice to see. In stream A, we had a lot of discussions. I would like particularly to thank Stefan again. As I mentioned, there were text messages, there were emails saying such a fantastic speaker. Thank you very much. Very inspiring. Many people thanked for your participation in the conference, and I joined those thanks. I would like to thank the local organizing committee, and especially I would like to thank Olga Zhenina, who is invisible, but who is always there, who is behind the screen. I would like to thank my wife, Elena Shadrina. If anybody didn't know that she was my wife, she's my wife, and I'm so grateful to her. We are sitting in next rooms. We didn't see each other, basically, because she's managing also the stream B. Olga was managing stream A. And the whole work of moving the conference from the on-campus design to online design, I had enormous help from the program committee also to quickly decide what we do with the program, so that we needed to compress the program. Many thanks go to the program committee as well. And now going through program committee, Jürgen, many thanks to you for stepping in the last moment to chair one of the longest sessions. I was chairing the parallel one. For keeping the participants on time as well. I would like to thank the chairs of the other sessions, Maria Malocek, who started this morning, Peter Parshakov, who started the second session in the morning, and also Laura Brardi, who is still here and who joined yesterday because initially another colleague was supposed to chair the session, but they couldn't do it, and Laura Brardi was very friendly and helpful and helped us to chair the session. Thank you very much. It was, in my view, a good conference, a very good conference, many good talks. I learned a lot from this conference, and I'm looking forward to the next year conference, but I wish it is less stress, and I wish it is on campus, and we all have more time in the breaks, because the short breaks this year were just because of the online format. Normally we would have longer breaks and drinks and chats, and I'm looking forward
of course,
to that.
Next time.
Yeah, next year.
And I think we should all join into thanking Dima and his wife and his organizing committee for organizing this conference. Thank you very much, Dima.
And the Higher School of Economics, which keeps
of course the sponsor. Yeah, okay, of course.
Have a very good day. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.